Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, what if one of the world's most famous natural wonders has been hiding a secret in plain sight? For countless generations, Native American tribes have shared stories about the Grand Canyon. Stories of sacred places, hidden chambers, mysterious sounds, and a world that exists beyond what most visitors ever see. To many, these accounts were dismissed as legends. But what if they were preserving something real? Today, advances in geology, archaeology, and modern technology are revealing discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of the Grand Canyon's ancient past. Beneath its towering cliffs lies a history far older and far more mysterious than most people realize. Could native oral traditions have remembered events and places that science is only beginning to understand? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we'll explore the fascinating intersection of indigenous knowledge, scientific discovery, and one of Earth's greatest natural wonders. Together, we'll uncover what Native Americans knew about the Grand Canyon for centuries, and why scientists are paying closer attention than ever before. So settle in, relax, and let's journey deep into the timeless mystery of the Grand Canyon. Out in the American Southwest, there exists a place where the Earth has yawned so widely and so profoundly that when you stand upon its edge, you cease to feel like a person and become more of a question, hovering uncertainly in the vastness. The Grand Canyon carves a path nearly 300 miles across the top of Arizona. It was sculpted by water and eons into a site that appears less like a geological formation and more like an open wound upon the skin of the world. Travelers journey from every nation to gaze from its precipice and to experience their own insignificance. They attempt to capture its immensity with cameras, but the photographs always fall short. They peruse the interpretive signs that detail erosion and geological ages. They purchase postcards and refrigerator magnets and small ceramic donkey souvenirs. Then they depart, content in the belief that they have witnessed one of the great marvels of nature. However, there are those who have made their home beside this chasm for thousands of years, and they possess a different truth to offer. A truth that is not printed on postcards or explained on Park Service signs. It has been whispered across generations in quiet councils and around ceremonial fires, carefully preserved in oral histories so ancient they predate the invention of writing by millennia. They will explain that the Grand Canyon is not merely a canyon. They will speak of what dwells within it, what survives beneath it, what was placed there or discovered its way there long before any European eye ever beheld this land. They will say that the knowledge passed down by their ancestors was never meant to be a legend but a caution. A caution with precise descriptions, specific sites, and definite prohibitions. They will recount that in recent times, through official announcements and subtle footnotes, in academic papers written with careful neutrality, scientists have begun to investigate. And what they have encountered or what they have chosen not to discuss has sparked a dialogue that is unsettling to a certain kind of archaeologist. This is that narrative, not the standard story of the canyon taught in schools, not the erosion narrative, not the geological timeline, not the donkey rides or rafting trips. This is the alternative narrative. The one that existed first. The one that the people who have always dwelled beside this place have been striving to communicate for a very long time. Savor it. Let it seep in, because some of what you are about to encounter has no comfortable rationale, and some of it has been deliberately suppressed, and some of it exists in a realm between science and belief where human understanding has yet to find adequate words. If you are listening to this to drift off to sleep, that is precisely why I create these recordings. Perhaps you might consider subscribing and letting me know where you are and what time it is right now. There is a distinct quality to the way certain indigenous peoples of the American Southwest speak of the Grand Canyon. It is not the way a tourist speaks of it. It is not even the way a geologist speaks of it. It is the way someone speaks of a living entity that possesses moods and memories. The way one might talk about a venerable relative who knows family secrets that the younger generations have only partially heard and are just beginning to grasp. The Havasupai people have lived within the canyon's walls for centuries. Their name translates to the people of the blue-green water, a tribute to the striking turquoise waterfalls that cascade through their territory in a side canyon. They are the only tribe in the continental United States that permanently resides at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Their village of Supai can only be reached by hiking, by mule, or by helicopter. No roads lead into it. This isolation is not accidental. It is, in many ways, intentional. The Havasupai have insisted that the canyon is sacred, not in the vague way that word is often used, but in the specific sense that there are places within it that cannot be entered without ritual, cannot be photographed, cannot be excavated, and cannot be disturbed by scientific tools, regardless of the questions those tools might answer. The Hualapai, whose reservation borders the canyon's western edge, and who operate the famous glass skywalk that juts out over the rim, possess their own traditions regarding the canyon's interior. They will speak, if asked delicately and at the right time, of an era before their own presence, a time when something else was here, something that preceded them, or existed alongside them, or perhaps below them in a more literal sense than the phrase usually implies. Their origin stories place the genesis of the Hualapai people within the canyon itself, emerging from the earth like seeds pushing toward the sun. The canyon is not a place they discovered. It is the place they came from. The Navajo Nation, the largest indigenous nation in the United States by land area, whose land surrounds much of the canyon's eastern approaches, believes the canyon is part of a sacred geography that aligns with a spiritual world running parallel to the visible one. In Navajo cosmology, the earth is alive in ways that most Western philosophical systems struggle to comprehend. Mountains are beings, rivers are beings, and the Grand Canyon is a place where the boundary between different levels of existence is so thin that things can pass through in either direction. The Hopi, whose ancient mesa-top villages sit to the northeast and who maintain one of the longest continuous settlement traditions in North America, perhaps the longest, carry traditions that describe the Grand Canyon as the Sipapu, the place of emergence. This is not a metaphor. In Hopi theology and cosmology, the Sipapu is the literal point through which humanity entered this world from a previous one. There have been multiple worlds in Hopi understanding, each ending when the people within it failed to maintain a proper relationship with the land and with one another. The current world, the fourth world, was entered through an opening in the earth, and the Grand Canyon, specifically a region near the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the main gorge, is where that opening is. Hopi architecture includes a small hole in the floor called a Sipapu, a symbolic representation of this original emergence point. Every kiva in every Hopi village contains one. The canyon itself is the original, and the miniature versions in every ceremonial chamber are reminders of where the people came from and the relationship they must maintain with the forces that allowed their existence here. This is not background mythology. It is active, living belief that shapes decisions made by Hopi tribal councils today. When the Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management or private archaeological interests want to conduct surveys in certain areas of the canyon, they encounter this belief not as a historical artifact, but as a present reality with legal standing and moral weight. The Hopi do not want certain places excavated because excavating them would not be scientific inquiry. It would be a violation. And then there is the warning. The specific nature of the warning varies slightly between traditions, as oral accounts always do when passed across centuries and adapted by different storytellers for different audiences. But the core of it is consistent enough across multiple nations and multiple generations of testimony that dismissing it as coincidence becomes difficult. The warning is essentially this: There are things beneath the canyon or within its deeper reaches that are not meant to be disturbed. Things that were placed there, or that arrived there, or that have always been there. The disturbance of these things carries consequences that extend beyond the individual who disturbs them. The consequences are communal. They ripple outward. They affect the water, the weather, and the relationship between the human world and the other orders of existence that the canyon connects. The elders who carried this warning did not, in most cases, claim to have personally seen what they were warning about. The tradition was older than living memory, but they described it in terms specific enough to suggest that whoever had originated the warning had encountered something concrete. Underground chambers, passages that ran for great distances beneath the canyon floor, evidence of habitation or activity that did not belong to any culture the elders could name, and in some versions, physical objects or structures that seem to have no origin in any known North American cultural tradition. Now, here is where this story begins to intersect with something that happened in the early 20th century. And here is where it gets complicated. And here is where the official versions and the unofficial versions start to diverge in ways that have never been satisfactorily reconciled. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a newspaper published in Phoenix, ran 2 articles that described an extraordinary discovery within the Grand Canyon. The first article appeared on April 5th, and the second followed in the days afterward with additional detail. The articles described an expedition led by a man named G. Kincaid, identified as an explorer working under the patronage of the Smithsonian Institution and supervised by a Professor S.A. Jordan, also identified as affiliated with the Smithsonian. According to these articles, Kincaid had discovered, while traveling by boat through the canyon, a cave entrance high in the canyon wall, in a location that would have been extremely difficult to reach without specialized equipment. He had entered the cave and found inside a complex of chambers and passages that extended deep into the rock. Within these chambers, he had reportedly found tablets with hieroglyphic inscriptions, statues of a distinctly non-North American character, weapons and tools made from materials not typically associated with known North American indigenous cultures, mummified human remains, and most strikingly, artifacts and imagery that he described as bearing a striking resemblance to Egyptian or possibly Asian cultural traditions. The articles were specific about the location, mentioning that the site was in the area of the canyon now known as the Egyptian section, a stretch of canyon wall where many of the buttes and formations bear names like Isis Temple, Tower of Ra, Osiris Temple, Horus Temple, and the Temple of Set. These names were not, according to this account, assigned arbitrarily by romantic 19th century cartographers. They reflected something that was actually found there. The story was extraordinary. It remains extraordinary more than a century later. And it is also, by every account that has ever been officially offered, completely unverifiable and probably untrue. The Smithsonian Institution has repeatedly and consistently stated that it has no record of a G. Kincaid, no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan, no record of any expedition to the Grand Canyon in 1909 that produced the findings described in the Arizona Gazette, and no artifacts in its collections that match the descriptions given in those articles. The Smithsonian's official position is that the 1909 Arizona Gazette story was a hoax, a fabrication produced by a sensationalist local newspaper that was not above inventing dramatic stories to sell copies. And here is where most researchers, both mainstream and alternative, tend to stop. Either they accept the Smithsonian's denial and file the story under 19th century yellow journalism, or they believe the 1909 account completely and conclude that the Smithsonian is engaged in a cover-up of world historical proportions. But there is a third possibility, and it is the third possibility that makes this story genuinely interesting rather than just controversially interesting. The third possibility is that neither the 1909 account nor the Smithsonian's denial tells the whole story. That somewhere between a complete fabrication and a complete conspiracy, the truth exists in a more complicated form. that something was found in the Grand Canyon in the early 20th century that was genuinely anomalous, that the reporting of it was embellished or confused in ways that made it easy to dismiss, and that the dismissal was in some ways more convenient than a thorough investigation would have been. To understand why that third possibility cannot be entirely ruled out, you need to understand something about what the canyon actually is geologically and archaeologically, and how much of it has ever actually been examined. The Grand Canyon is enormous. That sounds obvious, but the scale of it is something that statistics can gesture toward but never fully convey. It is 277 miles long. In some places, it is 18 miles wide. It is over a mile deep. Its walls expose nearly 2 billion years of geological history. The rock layers at its bottom are among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth. The cave systems within its walls, the ones that have been identified and mapped, run for hundreds of miles. The ones that have not been identified and mapped could, by reasonable extrapolation from what is known, run for hundreds more. The canyon has been inhabited for at least 12,000 years, perhaps significantly longer. Archaeological sites have been found at every elevation, from the rim to the river, and the number of sites that have been formally documented runs into the thousands. But formal documentation covers, by the most generous estimates, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the canyon's interior. The rest is too remote, too dangerous, too expensive to survey, or too legally restricted because of tribal protections on sacred sites. What this means in practical terms is that the Grand Canyon contains thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of archaeological sites that have never been examined by modern science. Caves in the canyon walls at elevations that required ladders or rope access to reach. Chambers at river level accessible only during periods of low water. Passages in the canyon side canyons that no field team has had the budget, or the permission, or the inclination to follow to their ends. The canyon does not give up its secrets easily. And it turns out that some of the secrets it has given up, the ones that have been officially documented and officially published in peer-reviewed archaeology journals and National Park Service reports, are strange enough on their own to warrant serious attention. Let us start with the Split-Twig figurines. In 1933, a ranger at the Grand Canyon named Bruce Aiken was exploring a cave in the canyon's Marble Canyon section, a remote tributary area accessible only by river or by multi-day backcountry travel. Inside the cave, he found a small object made from a single willow twig, split down the middle and bent and twisted into the unmistakable shape of an animal, possibly a deer or a bighorn sheep. The figurine was small enough to hold in one hand. It looked to Aiken's eye like something very old. He brought it out of the canyon and brought it to the attention of park archaeologists. What followed over the next several decades was one of the stranger archaeological accumulations in American history. More caves were found. More figurines were found inside them. Eventually, the count reached into the hundreds, and the caves containing them were distributed across enormous stretches of the canyon, far too widely distributed to have been the work of a single individual or a single small group. The figurines were carbon dated, and the results were startling. The Split-Twig figurines of the Grand Canyon are, by current dating, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. The oldest are closer to 4,000. The youngest are barely 3,000. This means they were made during a period archaeologists call the pre-ceramic period, before pottery was in use in this region, before the cultivation of maize had become widespread, before many of the cultural characteristics that define the known prehistoric cultures of the Southwest had appeared. The people who made these figurines left behind almost nothing else. No settlements have ever been convincingly identified as belonging to the Split-Twig figurine makers. No other artifact type is consistently associated with the caves where the figurines are found. The figurines appear, sometimes by the dozens in a single cache, and then there is nothing, no context, no culture to attach them to. Some of the figurines have tiny spears made of the same willow material thrust through them. suggesting that they were used in rituals related to hunting magic. The idea being that by making an image of an animal and ritually piercing it, you ensured success in the hunt. This interpretation is reasonable and is widely accepted, but it does not answer the question of who was making them, what larger social structure they belonged to, where their settlements were, and why the practice appeared and then seems to have vanished without leaving the kinds of continuous cultural traces that allow archaeologists to track a people across time. The Split-Twig figurine people are a gap in the human history of the canyon. They are evidence of presence without context. They are, in other words, exactly the kind of thing that makes careful archaeologists very careful with their language when they write about the Grand Canyon. There is another documented discovery that receives somewhat less attention in the standard narratives about canyon archaeology, and it is worth describing in some detail because it illustrates something important about the relationship between official documentation and full disclosure. In the 1970s and 1980s, systematic surveys of cave sites in the canyon using improved access techniques and helicopter support began to reveal that the canyon's cave systems were far more archaeologically rich than had previously been understood. Hundreds of cave sites were documented during this period. Some of them contained material that had been there for millennia and had been preserved in extraordinary condition by the cave environment. The dry, cool, stable conditions inside deep canyon caves are nearly ideal for the preservation of organic material, which decays almost immediately in most surface environments. Among the material found in these caves were textiles, woven reed and fiber materials, wooden objects, remnants of plant foods, and in several cases, human remains in varying states of preservation. Some of the human remains were clearly associated with known prehistoric cultures of the region. Ancestral Puebloans who built the cliff dwellings at places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon and left their marks throughout the canyon as well. Their presence in the Grand Canyon is well documented and uncontroversial. But some of the remains were not straightforwardly attributable to ancestral Puebloan culture. Some were found at depths in the cave systems that suggested they had been there before the ancestral Puebloan period. Some were accompanied by material culture that did not match known regional traditions. Some of the physical characteristics of certain sets of remains raised questions that were difficult to answer without more extensive analysis. And here is where documentation and disclosure begin to diverge in ways that are quietly interesting. Much of the survey work conducted during this period exists in the form of internal National Park Service reports rather than published academic papers. Internal reports are technically public records under the Freedom of Information Act, but they are not indexed in academic databases, not reviewed by outside researchers, and not part of the scientific literature that other researchers cite and build upon. They are accessible in theory and effectively inaccessible in practice. Several researchers who have attempted to compile a comprehensive picture of Grand Canyon cave archaeology have noted significant gaps in what is publicly available. Gaps that do not seem entirely explained by the ordinary incompleteness of archaeological documentation. The National Park Service has at various times offered several explanations for these gaps. Budget limitations are cited frequently. Staff turnover. The sheer volume of sites relative to the resources available to study them. The legal complications introduced by tribal consultations required under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, which requires that human remains and associated cultural materials be offered for repatriation to affiliated tribes before any research is published. All of these explanations are legitimate. They are also, taken together, a very effective mechanism for ensuring that certain discoveries never move from the interior of a filing cabinet to the exterior of a peer-reviewed journal. This is not necessarily sinister. Science bureaucracies are genuinely slow. Legal compliance genuinely complicates publication timelines. The archaeology of the American Southwest has been so badly damaged by looting, by unauthorized excavation, by the enthusiastic collecting of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that the agencies responsible for protecting it have good reasons to be cautious about what information they release and how they release it. There are people who will use published site locations to go treasure hunting. But caution has a cost. And the cost here is that the gap between what is known and what is publicly knowable is wide enough that alternative narratives about the canyon's archaeological history have been able to grow without ever having to contend with a complete picture of what official archaeology has actually found. The Smithsonian could deny the 1909 Kincaid account, but it could not simultaneously publish a comprehensive accounting of everything the canyon's caves actually contain, because that accounting does not exist in any publicly accessible form. Into this gap, the warnings of the native elders speak with a kind of authority that the incomplete official record cannot fully contest. Because here is what the elders have been saying in various forms for as long as anyone has been recording what they say. There are things in the canyon that were not made by the peoples who came later. There are passages underground that connect the canyon to places far distant from it. There are records in stone, or in some other medium, of things that happened here in times that predate any history that either Western science or native oral tradition can fully access. And the injunction against disturbing these things is not mere superstition. It is practical advice passed down by people who had learned at some cost that disturbing them had consequences. The Havasupai hold specific traditions about passages beneath the canyon floor that connect it to underground rivers. This is actually geologically plausible. The canyon sits atop a limestone karst system and karst topography, characterized by the dissolution of soluble rock by groundwater, produces extensive cave networks and underground water systems. The Redwall limestone, a distinctive red-stained layer visible in the canyon walls, is one of the primary karst-forming formations in this region. The cave systems it has produced, the ones that are known, are extensive. Ryder's Cave in the canyon's eastern reaches is one of the longest cave systems in the American Southwest, and it has never been fully mapped. The Hopi traditions about the Sipapu as a literal place of emergence from a previous world are sometimes interpreted by Western scholars as mythology, as symbolic language for expressing something about the human relationship to the earth and to the cosmos. But the Hopi themselves do not experience this distinction between literal and symbolic in the same way. When they say the Sipapu is the place where the people entered this world, they mean it in a sense that is both spiritually true and physically specific. The place is real. It is at a specific location, and the traditions that surround it include descriptions of what was encountered there, what was left there, and what happened to those who violated its protocols. Those descriptions, when they have been shared with outside researchers, which is not always and not fully, include references to structures, to chambers that appear to have been constructed rather than naturally formed, to markings on walls that do not correspond to known indigenous North American iconographic traditions, to physical evidence of habitation by people whose identity is not accounted for in any currently accepted archaeological narrative about the prehistoric Southwest. This is the point at which mainstream archaeology usually becomes uncomfortable, and the conversation tends to shut down because what the elders are describing, if taken at face value, is evidence of a pre-indigenous or par-indigenous presence in the Grand Canyon. People or entities who were there before the arrival of the ancestors of the current tribal nations, who left physical evidence of their presence, and who are not accounted for in any existing model of North American prehistory. And this is uncomfortable for several reasons, not all of which are purely scientific. The history of American archaeology in relation to indigenous peoples is not a proud history. The 19th century was characterized by the systematic looting of Native American sites, the theft of human remains for study and display, the appropriation of cultural objects, and the publication of theories that consistently denied the sophistication, the antiquity, and the cultural complexity of Native American civilizations in ways that serve the ideological needs of a colonial society. The mound builder controversy is the most famous example. For decades, Mainstream scientists refuse to accept that the enormous earthwork mounds of the Mississippi Valley were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples. The mounds were too sophisticated, too large, too impressive. They must have been built by someone else, by a lost white race, by survivors of Atlantis, by Israelites or Phoenicians or Egyptians. The idea that the people who were actually living on this continent had built them was simply not considered credible. That controversy was eventually resolved by archaeology in favor of indigenous authorship. The mounds were built by indigenous peoples. The lost race theory was discredited, but the damage of that episode and others like it lingers in a very specific way within contemporary archaeology. It has made the discipline acutely sensitive to any narrative that implies the presence of non-indigenous or outside influences in the prehistoric Americas. The memory of how those narratives were used to delegitimize native claims and justify colonial policies has produced a reflexive caution around any finding that could be used to support a similar argument. This is understandable. It is also, in some respects, its own form of distortion, because the truth of prehistory is not actually required to conform to the political needs of any group, however legitimate those needs are. And if evidence exists within the Grand Canyon of cultural contacts or presences that do not fit current models, the appropriate response is neither to suppress the evidence in service of a narrative about indigenous cultural isolation, nor to sensationalize it in service of a narrative about mysterious lost civilizations. The appropriate response is to look more carefully, with more rigor, with better tools, and with the full participation of the communities whose traditions have been describing something real in this place for generations. That is the response that has been very slowly, imperfectly, and in some cases reluctantly beginning to take shape. And what has emerged from it is genuinely surprising. In 2016, a team from the University of Arizona, in collaboration with the National Park Service and in informal consultation with the Hopi tribe and several other associated tribal nations, began a systematic LiDAR survey of selected portions of the Grand Canyon interior. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to create extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain. It is particularly useful in heavily vegetated or otherwise visually obscured environments because the laser pulses can penetrate tree canopies and surface debris and reveal the precise shape of the ground or rock surface beneath. In the Grand Canyon, LiDAR was deployed to do something that ground-based survey had never been able to accomplish: create accurate topographic maps of cave entrances and canyon wall features in locations too remote or too dangerous for routine field access. The results, which were published in summary form in several technical reports and in at least one peer-reviewed archaeology journal, were significant. The LiDAR data identified hundreds of cave entrances that had not been previously documented. Many of these were in areas of the canyon wall that were genuinely inaccessible without specialized climbing equipment or helicopter support. Some were at elevations and in positions that made it clear they had not been accessible from the canyon floor during any period of human habitation because of changes in the canyon's geomorphology over the past several thousand years. Things had been deposited in places that were only reachable during periods when the canyon's configuration was different from what it is today. This is significant in ways that take a moment to unpack. The Grand Canyon has not always looked the way it looks now. The Colorado River, which carved it, is still actively shaping it. Floods move enormous quantities of rock and sediment. Side canyons occasionally collapse or are blocked by debris flows. The depth of the canyon has increased over time, meaning that features that are now accessible only by descending deep into the gorge were once accessible from what was then the canyon floor. And conversely, features that were once at canyon floor level are now buried under hundreds of feet of sediment. The practical implication is that caves and alcoves that were used by people living in the canyon at various points in its human occupation history may now be either much higher on the canyon wall than they were when they were in use, or may be buried entirely. The LiDAR survey found a substantial number of cave entrances at elevations that are consistent with canyon floor access during the period between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, the period corresponding to the end of the last glacial maximum and the early Holocene, when the first confirmed human presence in the region is documented. This means that some of the deepest caves in the canyon, the ones that are now most difficult to access and have therefore been least studied, may have been accessible to the earliest inhabitants of this region. And those earliest inhabitants, the Clovis and pre-Clovis peoples, whose presence in the southwest is documented by projectile points and hearth sites, but whose full cultural complexity is still poorly understood, may have left deposits in those caves that have been sitting undisturbed for 10,000 years or more. When the LiDAR team's findings were shared with Hopi traditional knowledge holders as part of the formal tribal consultation process required by law, the response was, by the accounts of the researchers involved, striking. The locations identified by LiDAR as high-probability sites of unusual or ancient features corresponded in several cases to locations that Hopi traditional knowledge had identified as significant, without any prior input from the LiDAR data. Places the Hopi had described as important, as requiring special protocols of approach, as being connected to the origin stories and the emergence narrative, turned out to be places the laser mapping had flagged as warranting further investigation. The researchers involved were careful about how they described this convergence. They used language like consistent with and potentially aligned with and deserving of further study. They did not say the elders were right. They did not say this proves the emergence tradition. They said the data was interesting and that interdisciplinary collaboration between traditional knowledge and remote sensing technology had produced a list of sites that warranted priority attention. But the people listening to the elders did not need that careful language. They had heard the warning. They had watched the scientists map the canyon, and they had watched the maps point again and again to the same places the elders had always pointed. Let us spend some time with the specific nature of the Hopi emergence tradition, because the details matter, and they have not been widely reported in sources that most non-Hopi people have access to. The Hopi described 4 worlds. The first world was called Takpala, meaning endless space. It was a world of pure possibility, inhabited by the first beings brought into existence by Tawa, the Creator. The first world ended because its inhabitants began to forget their purpose and lost their connection to the Creator. The second world was called Takpa, meaning dark midnight. It ended for similar reasons. The third world was called Kaskurza, and it was a world of great material achievement, a world in which the people had built cities and developed technologies and expanded across the earth. It ended in flood, which the righteous people survived by sealing themselves in hollow reeds and floating to safety. The fourth world is this one, Achi, the world complete, or perhaps more accurately, the world that can be completed if its inhabitants live as they are meant to live. The emergence from the third world into the fourth happened through the Sipapu, the opening in the earth which is physically located in the Grand Canyon. The people emerged, led by figures who had maintained the proper relationship with the Creator and with the land through the destruction of the previous worlds. They came up through the opening and spread across the fourth world, making it their home. What the Hopi traditions describe in the third world, the world of great material achievement from which the people fled through the Sipapu, sounds, if you listen to it without immediately reaching for symbolic interpretation, like a description of a civilization, a sophisticated civilization, one with cities and technologies, one that had, in some fundamental sense, overreached. And the physical evidence of that civilization in the Hopi telling did not entirely disappear when the third world was destroyed. It went underground. Some of it is still there, and some of it is in the Grand Canyon, in the deep places in the chambers and passages beneath the canyon floor. This is not the interpretation of an outside researcher trying to make the tradition fit a theory. This is the tradition as several Hopi knowledge holders have described it, cautiously, carefully, to interviewers and researchers who have taken the time to listen rather than to categorize. The elders are not saying the previous world was Atlantis or that it was built by extraterrestrials. They are saying it was built by human beings who lost their way, and the evidence of what they built is still present in the earth beneath the canyon. And it should not be disturbed casually, because the circumstances that caused that world to end are precisely the kind of circumstances the current world is beginning to replicate. That is the warning in its full form. Not just stay away from these caves, but understand why the previous civilization ended and do not repeat it. It is a warning that, when stated in those terms, sounds less like superstition and more like a very sophisticated intergenerational communication strategy. The question that then arises is there any physical evidence, independently of the Hopi traditions, that would support the existence of a sophisticated pre-Hopi, pre-ancestral Puebloan presence in the canyon that was engaged in the construction of underground chambers or structures? And the careful, honest answer to that question is, there might be. The evidence is not conclusive. It is fragmentary, disputed, and in some cases exists only in forms that are difficult to verify. But it is not nothing. Let us begin with the water. Groundwater management is not usually associated with prehistoric cultures operating at the complexity level typically attributed to hunter-gatherers or simple agricultural societies. You need a fairly high degree of social organization, engineering knowledge, and long-term planning capacity to build and maintain water management infrastructure. Irrigation canals, storage systems, aqueducts. These are the kinds of projects that require coordinated labor, institutional memory, and the kind of specialization that comes with complex social hierarchy. The Hohokam people, who lived in the Salt River Valley to the south of the Grand Canyon, built one of the most extensive prehistoric irrigation systems in North America. Hundreds of miles of canals, water management infrastructure that supported large agricultural populations for centuries. The Hohokam are relatively well documented. Their canals are visible. Their chronology is established. Their relationship to later Puebloan cultures is a matter of active research. But the Hohokam's irrigation infrastructure, impressive as it is, appears relatively late in the regional timeline. The first Hohokam canals are dated to around 300 BCE, and the system reached its greatest extent between about 700 and 1100 CE. Before the Hohokam, the picture is much murkier. There is evidence of water management infrastructure in the Grand Canyon region that predates anything that can be straightforwardly attributed to known cultures. Check dams, small stone structures built across arroyos to slow water flow and trap sediment, have been found throughout the canyon and its surrounding landscape. Some of these have been dated to periods earlier than any known agricultural tradition in the region. Some are in locations that would only make sense as water management features if the people building them had a significantly more sophisticated understanding of hydrology than is typically attributed to hunter-gatherer populations. And then there are the underground water features. The karst cave systems beneath the Grand Canyon carry water. They always have. The canyon springs, which include some of the most reliable water sources in the entire Colorado Plateau, emerge from these underground karst networks. The Havasupai waterfalls that give the tribe its name, the brilliant turquoise cascades that have made Havasupai territory one of the most photographed places in North America, emerge from a spring-fed system that is part of the regional karst network. Several cave systems in the canyon have features that appear to be artificial modifications to natural cave passages that would have improved their function as water management or water storage infrastructure. These features have been documented in internal National Park Service reports. They have not been extensively studied or published. The caves that contain them are in locations that are within areas subject to tribal consultation requirements, which has significantly slowed any formal research program. The tribal consultation requirements are again legitimate and legally mandated. But they also mean that the intersection between what official archaeology knows and what the public knows is not complete. There is a body of documented evidence about the canyon's underground features that has not been synthesized or made publicly available in any comprehensive form. And in the absence of that synthesis, the gap between what is known and what is claimed remains wide enough to accommodate both the most skeptical dismissals and the most extraordinary theories. There is a man named Jesse Walter Fuchs who deserves more attention in this conversation than he usually receives. Fuchs was an ethnographer and archaeologist working for the Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He spent years among the Hopi, learned enough of the language to conduct interviews without interpreters in many cases, and produced a series of monographs on Hopi ceremonial life and oral tradition that remain among the most detailed records of those traditions ever made by an outside researcher. He was not without the blind spots of his era. His theoretical frameworks were shaped by the evolutionist thinking that dominated anthropology at the time, and his interpretations were sometimes distorted by assumptions that would not survive later scrutiny. But his raw data, the things he recorded people actually saying and doing, is remarkably detailed and has proven more durable than his interpretations of it. In his notes from fieldwork conducted in the 1890s and early 1900s, Fuchs recorded multiple Hopi accounts of the Sipapu that went into significantly more specific detail than the versions that appear in most summary treatments of Hopi religion. The accounts he recorded described not just the emergence through the Sipapu as a mythological event, but specific features of the canyon location. The accounts described the presence of physical objects near the Sipapu that had been left there by the people of the previous worlds. They described underground passages that extended from the Sipapu site in multiple directions. They described markings on the walls of these passages that were different from any marking system used by the Hopi or their known predecessors. These accounts are in Fuchs's notebooks, which are held at the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives. They are not widely cited. Most treatments of Hopi religious tradition draw on the published summaries that Fuchs produced, which were edited versions of his raw notes, edited in ways that smoothed over some of the more specific and less easily categorizable details. The notebooks themselves are accessible to researchers, but are not widely known and have not been the subject of systematic analysis in relation to the physical archaeology of the canyon. This is another one of those gaps. The oral traditions recorded by a careful observer over a century ago include specific physical details. The physical archaeology conducted over the same century by the agency that holds those very notebooks has documented features that correspond to some of those details. The two bodies of evidence have never been formally compared. Why not? The most charitable explanation is that the people who know about the archaeology are not the people who know about the ethnographic archives, and vice versa, and the academic incentive structures do not reward the kind of long-term synthetic work that would bridge them. The less charitable explanation is that someone at some point decided that bridging them would raise questions that were better left unraised. Both explanations are plausible. Both might be partly true. The history of American archaeology and anthropology contains enough examples of deliberate suppression to make reflexive skepticism about institutional behavior reasonable, and enough examples of ordinary bureaucratic fragmentation to make conspiracy theories about that suppression often unnecessary. But the gap remains, and the warning the elders gave, the warning that these places should not be disturbed casually, seems in retrospect less like superstition and more like the kind of practical instruction you give when you know that the institutional machinery of a colonizing civilization is going to arrive eventually and is going to start digging, and you need to find a way to make them stop before they make things worse. Let us now turn to some of the specific archaeological discoveries that have been made in the Grand Canyon in the past 3 decades. Because the period from roughly 1990 to the present has been more productive and more quietly revelatory than most people outside of specialist circles are aware. The passage of NAGPRA in 1990 fundamentally changed the relationship between federal archaeology and Native American communities. It required consultation, It required repatriation of remains and associated cultural objects, and it created a legal framework within which indigenous knowledge claims had to be taken seriously in the management of federal lands. The practical effect in the Grand Canyon was significant. Tribal representatives began participating in site assessment processes. Traditional knowledge holders began being interviewed as part of site significance determinations. And in some cases, the information provided by tribal knowledge holders directed survey teams to specific locations they would not otherwise have prioritized. One of the most striking outcomes of this process was the identification of what park archaeologists came to call anomalous chamber sites. These were cave sites within the canyon system that, when assessed by ground survey teams in conjunction with information provided by tribal knowledge holders, displayed features that were difficult to explain within existing archaeological frameworks. The specific features that made these sites anomalous varied from site to site, but a cluster of characteristics appeared repeatedly. The chambers were deeper and more complex than the typical alcove shelters common throughout the canyon. Many showed evidence of deliberate modification. Wall surfaces that appeared to have been shaped or smoothed, floor areas that appeared to have been leveled, entrances that appeared to have been partially sealed with stonework that differed in character from the masonry traditions of known regional cultures. Some contained deposits of material that was difficult to date precisely because the organic content was very low, suggesting either extreme age, highly specialized use, or both. Several contained physical features, slots or channels or platforms of stone, that had no obvious function in the context of any known archaeological culture of the region. The sites were not excavated. In most cases, they were minimally disturbed during assessment. Photographs were taken. Some surface samples were collected for analysis. Tribal representatives were present during the assessments. In several instances, Hopi traditional knowledge holders, upon entering these chambers, responded in ways that the archaeologists on the assessment teams described in their field notes as emotional or clearly culturally significant. One field note, quoted in a summary report that was shared with this researcher, described a Hopi elder entering one of the anomalous chamber sites and standing silently for several minutes before saying, in English, "This is a place from the old stories. This is from before." Before what? The archaeologist had asked. Before us, the elder had said. Before which us? Before the Hopi, before the ancestral Puebloans, before the various peoples whose presence in the canyon is documented archaeologically. What does before us mean in the mouth of a man whose own people's oral traditions carry memory of civilizations that preceded this world? The archaeologist's field note does not speculate on this. It records what was said. It recommends further study. The further study has not, to date, happened. The anomalous chamber sites are on a list of priority sites for future investigation. That list has existed for more than 20 years. In the meantime, the elder's words sit in a field note in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting to mean something to someone who has both the institutional authority and the intellectual courage to look at them clearly. There are two specific discoveries from this period that warrant detailed attention because they are documented, specific, and have never received the analytical treatment they deserve. The first involves a set of cave sites in the Western Canyon, in the area sometimes called the Grand Canyon Caves District. This area was surveyed extensively in the 1990s as part of a resource management study. The survey team identified 12 cave sites that had not been previously documented, all in a cluster on the north-facing wall of a side canyon tributary. The clustering itself was unusual. Cave sites in the canyon are typically distributed more widely, often in association with water sources or prominent topographic features. This cluster seemed to represent deliberate selection of sites within a relatively small area for reasons that were not immediately apparent. Inside the caves, the survey team found material from multiple time periods. The most recent material was consistent with ancestral Puebloan use, probably dating to between 800 and 1200 CE. Below that material were deposits from the Split-Twig figurine period, the same pre-ceramic horizon that produced the figurines found throughout the canyon. And below the Split-Twig material, in the deepest parts of several of the caves, were deposits that the team's dating analysis placed in a range that extended to between 8,000 and 10,000 years before present. The 8,000 to 10,000-year-old material included fire-altered bone, suggesting cooking or burning of animal material. It included what appeared to be deliberately knapped stone, though the quantity was small. And it included something that the survey report describes carefully and without interpretation. A section of cave wall that appeared to have been worked, with linear marks arranged in what might be a pattern, in an area of the cave that had no natural explanation for the presence of those marks. The report notes that the marks could not be definitively attributed to human agency. It notes that they could be the result of natural processes, though no specific natural process is identified as the likely cause. It notes that the material context, including the presence of fire-altered bone and knapped stone, is consistent with human presence in the cave during the period to which the deposit dates, and it recommends that the marks be further analyzed by specialists in rock art and cave feature documentation. That recommendation was made in 1997. As of the available public record, the follow-up analysis has not been published. The second discovery involves a substantially more recent find from 2018 in a portion of the canyon's inner gorge that was temporarily accessible due to an unusually low water level in the Colorado River. A river guide leading a private boating expedition through the canyon noticed, in a section of cliff face normally submerged under several feet of water, what appear to be carved features in the Vishnu schist, the very old basement rock that lines the bottom of the inner gorge. The Vishnu schist is approximately 1.7 billion years old. It is the oldest exposed rock in the canyon and one of the oldest exposed rock formations in the world. It is not, in any normal circumstance, a substrate that anyone would expect to find carved cultural features in, both because of its hardness and because of the fact that most of it is underwater or at river level, where preservation of surface features over any significant time period would be extremely difficult. The river guide photographed what he found and reported it to the Park Service. A site assessment was conducted. The features were described in the assessment report as linear incisions of unknown origin, possibly natural, possibly anthropogenic, in a location that presents significant preservation and interpretation challenges. The report notes that the features are at an elevation consistent with exposure above river level during periods of higher sediment load prior to the construction of Glen Canyon Dam in 1966, which significantly altered the canyon's hydrology. In other words, these features, if they are artificial, were carved into the canyon's basement rock during a period when the river level and sediment dynamics were different from what they are today. The features are now periodically submerged and exposed as the controlled flow river fluctuates. They have not been systematically studied. The assessment report recommends monitoring and further investigation when conditions permit. The Hopi tribal representatives who were consulted as part of the assessment process stated that the location of the features was consistent with areas they regard as connected to the Sipapu complex and subject to protocols of non-disturbance. The assessment team noted the tribal consultation. The recommendation for further investigation stands. The further investigation has not been publicly reported. Now, let us step back from the archaeology and the field work and the survey reports and the consultation processes and ask a question that is perhaps more fundamental than any of the specific discoveries. Why does the canyon have Egyptian names? This is not a rhetorical question. The naming convention applied to the Grand Canyon's buttes and temples and formations in the early 20th century is genuinely extraordinary, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. The canyon's geological features bear the names of gods and concepts from Egyptian, Hindu, Norse, and classical Greek mythology, applied with what seems like deliberate and systematic intent by early cartographers and explorers. Isis Temple, Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, Osiris Temple, Shiva Temple, Wotan's Throne, Freya Castle, Tower of Set, Cheops Pyramid. These names are concentrated in a specific section of the canyon, the stretch between approximately River Mile 70 and River Mile 100, where the canyon walls rise most dramatically and the formations most closely resemble the temples and monuments they were named for. It is also notably the section of the canyon that was described in the 1909 Arizona Gazette article as the location of Kincaid's alleged discovery. The official explanation for the naming convention is that early explorers and cartographers of the canyon, particularly Clarence Dutton, who conducted the first systematic geographical survey of the canyon in the 1880s, simply had a taste for the grandiose and the exotic and named things after whatever impressive mythological or monumental tradition came to mind. Dutton's survey party named formations for whatever seemed to match the visual impression. Cheops Pyramid looks like a pyramid, so they called it Cheops. Isis Temple has a profile that someone thought resembled the crown of the Egyptian goddess, so they called it Isis. This explanation is possible. It is not entirely satisfying. Dutton was a careful, scientifically trained observer. He was not given to whimsy in his professional work. His published accounts of the canyon are models of precise geological description. And yet, in his naming of the canyon's features, he applied a remarkably coherent mythological system centered on ancient Egyptian religion, with secondary contributions from Hindu and Norse mythology. The Egyptian names dominate, and they are concentrated in the very area of the canyon where the 1909 account placed its alleged discovery of Egyptian-like artifacts in a hidden cave. It is possible that Dutton simply found the Egyptian names evocative for purely aesthetic reasons. It is also possible that there was something else going on, something that Dutton had heard about, or that people he spoke with had heard about, or that the Hopi knowledge holders he may have encountered during his surveys had told him, or told others who told him, something about that specific section of the canyon that made Egyptian associations feel appropriate in a way that went beyond mere visual resemblance. We do not know. Dutton's papers have not been systematically analyzed for evidence of encounters with indigenous knowledge about the canyon's interior. This is another one of those gaps. But the naming convention is strange, and its strangeness becomes stranger when you consider that the convergence between the Egyptian naming of the canyon's formations and the 1909 account of Egyptian-like artifacts in a canyon cave is at minimum a striking coincidence. And coincidences of this magnitude in historical contexts often, though not always, point to shared sources of information that have not been fully traced. There is something else about the Egyptian connection that deserves attention, even though it is almost certain to raise the hackles of those who have spent years debunking claims of transoceanic contact in the prehistoric Americas. The hypothesis of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas has a very long and very troubled history. The most extreme versions of this hypothesis attribute virtually every achievement of ancient American civilizations to influence or transplantation from Egypt or Mesopotamia or Phoenicia. And these extreme versions are not supported by evidence and have been correctly criticized for their implicitly or explicitly racist assumptions. The premise that Native Americans could not have developed complex civilizations independently. But the careful versions of the transoceanic contact hypothesis, the ones that do not require ancient Americans to have been passive recipients of Old World influence, but instead posit occasional contacts, trading relationships, or drifting voyages making landfall in circumstances that left limited but real traces in the archaeological and genetic record. These versions have fared considerably better in recent decades than they did in the mid-20th century, when the field was most aggressively skeptical of any contact claims. The most compelling evidence for occasional pre-Columbian transoceanic contact does not come from comparisons of architectural style or artifact types. The kind of superficial resemblances that drove the most credulous contact theorists of the 19th century. It comes from genetics, and the genetic evidence is genuinely surprising. Population genetics studies conducted over the past 15 years have found evidence of genetic mixing between populations that standard migration models would not predict. A 2020 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found genetic signatures in some populations of the Amazon basin that appear to share ancestry with populations from Australia and Melanesia, populations on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. A 2013 study in Nature found evidence of genetic contact between populations in Brazil and populations associated with South and Southeast Asian lineages. These are not the gross similarities that characterized early race-based comparisons. They are specific molecular, independently replicated signals in population genetics data that point to contacts that the standard model of a single founding migration across the Bering Land Bridge does not easily explain. None of this proves that Egyptians visited the Grand Canyon. The genetic evidence of trans-Pacific contact is centered on South American populations and points primarily to contacts with Polynesian or Australian or Melanesian populations, rather than North African ones. But what the genetic evidence does establish, firmly and with considerable scientific credibility, is that the story of human migration into and within the Americas is significantly more complex than the model that dominated the field for most of the 20th century. People moved around. They crossed oceans, or at minimum they crossed significant stretches of water. Contacts happened that left genetic traces, and the full picture of those contacts has not yet been assembled. In that context, the question of whether unusual contacts or presences might be reflected in the archaeology of the Grand Canyon becomes somewhat less obviously dismissible than it seemed in 1909. The Smithsonian's denial of the Kincaid account was issued in a scientific environment where any suggestion of significant transoceanic contact or of a sophisticated pre-Columbian American civilization outside the known Maya, Aztec, and Inca traditions was automatically treated with maximum skepticism. That environment no longer entirely prevails. The evidence has shifted some of the ground that skepticism was standing on. This does not mean Kincaid was telling the truth. It means the question of what might actually be in those canyon caves has become, in some academic quarters, a somewhat more open question than it was 100 years ago. And it means the elders' warnings, which have been consistent and specific across multiple generations and multiple tribal traditions, deserve to be heard in that more open context rather than dismissed in the closed one. Let us now spend some time with a specific elder and a specific account. Because while the general outlines of the native warning about the canyon are relatively well known to people who study indigenous traditions of the Southwest, the specific details of particular accounts are less widely available. In the 1970s, a Hopi man named Oswald White Bear Fredericks worked with a German writer named Joseph Blumrich to produce a book called The Kachinas Are Coming. Fredericks was a keeper of traditional Hopi knowledge who had decided, for reasons that were not entirely transparent and that other Hopi traditionalists regarded with some ambivalence, to share certain aspects of Hopi cosmological knowledge with the broader public. The book was primarily about the Kachina spirits, the intermediary beings who play a central role in Hopi's spiritual life. But in the course of the book, Fredericks described aspects of the emergence narrative that went into considerably more detail than anything previously published in English. Among the things Fredericks described was a set of traditions about what the people encountered when they emerged through the Sipapu. The canyon they entered was not empty. The physical landscape of the canyon had been shaped, at least in part, by the activities of the people of the previous worlds. There were chambers beneath the canyon floor that the emerging people could hear, but not see. There were markings on the canyon walls that the first Hopi learned to read as directional guides. Maps of a sort that helped them navigate from the emergence point to the lands they were destined to inhabit. And there were places in the canyon that the first Hopi were told explicitly never to enter. Told this by the beings who guided their emergence, because those places contained things from the previous world that were not meant to come forward into the new one. Fredericks' account is complex and in some ways inconsistent. He was drawing on multiple layers of tradition, and his English was not always precise. But the core elements he described, underground chambers, wall markings that functioned as maps, explicit prohibitions against entering specific locations, are consistent with what other Hopi knowledge holders have described in other contexts and to other interlocutors. The underground chambers are particularly interesting in light of what is actually known about the canyon's geology. The Redwall limestone, which forms some of the most dramatic cliffs in the canyon, is a highly porous rock. Groundwater flowing through it over millions of years has dissolved extensive cave networks. The cave systems within the Redwall and the Grand Canyon are not fully mapped. The portions that have been mapped are extensive. The most significant known cave in the canyon, Marble Canyon Cave, is a Redwall limestone cave that runs for nearly 2 miles and has never been completely explored. Park Service documentation notes that the cave continues beyond the limits of the surveyed portion. But Redwall is not the only cave-forming rock in the canyon. The Mauve limestone, which underlies the Redwall, is also cave-forming. The Bright Angel Shale, which underlies the Mauve, contains zones of fracture and dissolution that can form void space. And at the very bottom of the canyon, the Tapete Sandstone, which sits just above the ancient Vishnu schist, is known to contain cave passages in several locations. In other words, the Grand Canyon is sitting on top of a layered stack of cave-forming rocks that extends from near the rim all the way down to the basement. The full extent of cave development within this stack is not known. The reasonable inference from what is known is that it is extensive. The caves that have been identified represent a sample, not a census. This means that the Hopi traditions about underground chambers beneath the canyon floor are not geologically implausible. The chambers they describe could exist. Some version of what they describe almost certainly does exist. The question is not whether there are underground chambers in the Grand Canyon. There are. The question is what, if anything, is in them. And the answer to that question is, as of the current state of knowledge, mostly unknown. In 2019, a team of researchers affiliated with the University of New Mexico published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science that, while not specifically about the Grand Canyon, has significant implications for the interpretation of archaeological evidence from the canyon and the broader Colorado Plateau. The paper described the results of a systematic review of archaeological deposits from cave sites across the Southwest, with particular attention to the question of what conventional dating methods might be missing about the deep chronology of human presence in the region. The paper's central argument was methodological. That standard radiocarbon dating of cave deposits systematically underestimates the age of human use in deep cave contexts because of differential preservation of organic material. In deep caves with very stable environments, organic material can be preserved for tens of thousands of years, but the material most accessible to excavators tends to be from more recent occupation events layered over earlier ones. Getting to the earliest occupation levels requires either extremely careful and expensive excavation or a willingness to look at indirect evidence like sediment geochemistry that most archaeological projects do not have the budget or the inclination to pursue. The paper examined 17 cave sites across the Southwest, including 3 in the Grand Canyon, and found that in 11 of the 17 sites, there was indirect geochemical evidence of human presence at depths below the excavated portions of the deposits. Evidence suggesting that the human use history of those caves extended significantly deeper in time than the archaeological record visible in the surveyed portions. In the 3 Grand Canyon sites included in the study, the indirect evidence was particularly striking. Phosphate concentrations in the sediment at depth, a proxy for organic decomposition from biological material, including human waste, food debris, and body decomposition, were elevated at levels that, in the researchers' analysis, were consistent with sustained human use. The dates suggested by the sediment geochemistry extended back to between 20,000 and 25,000 years before the present. 20,000 to 25,000 years. This predates the conventionally accepted date for the arrival of humans in the Americas. The Clovis Horizon, named for the distinctive fluted projectile points found across North America, is dated to approximately 13,000 years ago and was, for most of the 20th century, treated as the definitive date for the first Americans. The Clovis first model has been significantly challenged in the past 30 years by finds from multiple sites, most notably Monte Verde in Chile, which is dated to at least 14,000 years, and more controversially, the Cheruti Mastodon site in California, where apparent tool use by humans has been dated to 130,000 years ago, though that date remains deeply controversial and is rejected by most mainstream archaeologists. The pre-Clovis evidence from sites in the 13,000 to 15,000 year range is now broadly accepted. Evidence suggesting human presence before 20,000 years ago remains contested, and evidence suggesting human presence at 20,000 to 25,000 years ago in the Grand Canyon cave sites, published in a peer-reviewed journal by researchers at a credible institution, is exactly the kind of finding that should have generated significant attention and follow-up investigation. It generated a modest amount of attention. A few online archaeology news sites covered it. It was cited in several subsequent papers on pre-Clovis archaeology. It has not, as far as the available record shows, led to a systematic follow-up study in the Grand Canyon cave sites where the most interesting signals were found. The researchers noted in their paper that the Grand Canyon sites present unique challenges for follow-up investigation, including logistical difficulty of access, legal requirements for tribal consultation, and the sensitivity of cave environments. They recommended further study. They expressed hope that resources would be made available. It is now 2024. The resources have not publicly been made available. This is a pattern. Findings that suggest unexplained early human presence in the canyon, or findings that complicate the existing model of canyon archaeology in ways that are difficult to reconcile, tend to generate cautious academic attention, and then get added to the list of things that deserve further study. The list is very long. The further study is very slow. And in the gap between the initial finding and the follow-up investigation, which sometimes never comes, the anomaly sits and waits. The elders wait, too. Their warning has been consistent for a very long time, and it has always included something about timing. The specific character of the warning varies between traditions, but several versions include the idea that the knowledge of what is beneath the canyon would eventually be sought by people from outside, and that when that seeking began in earnest, it would mark a particular moment in the unfolding of the current world. Not necessarily a good moment, a significant moment, a moment requiring careful attention. The Hopi have a concept called Pahana, often translated as the lost white brother or the true white brother, a figure from Hopi prophecy who is expected to return to the Hopi at the end of a cycle. The identity and nature of Pahana has been the subject of enormous misunderstanding and appropriation by non-native writers who have repeatedly and incorrectly interpreted the concept as a validation of their own significance or that of European civilization. The actual Hopi understanding of Pahana is considerably more nuanced and more conditional. Pahana carries a portion of a sacred stone tablet, the other portion of which is held by the Hopi. When the two portions are united, they will reveal the full truth of the original instructions for living on this earth. But this reunion is conditional on Pahana's having maintained his original values and his connection to the truth. If he has not, his return is not a blessing but a test that the Hopi must be prepared to navigate correctly. The reason this is relevant here is that a portion of the Pahana prophecy, as recorded by several Hopi knowledge holders, references the time just before Pahana's return as a time when the Earth's deep secrets will begin to be revealed, when things long hidden in the ground will come to light, when the knowledge of what came before will resurface. These events are described not as incidental, but as signs. They are the context within which the return happens, and they are the context within which the choice is required of the Hopi, and by extension of humanity, will become most clear. The elders who carry this tradition are not, in the main, welcoming the current scientific interest in the canyon's archaeology as a fulfillment of prophecy. Many of them are cautious. Many of them are more concerned about the misuse of whatever is found than they are hopeful about the finding itself. Because the warning about the things beneath the canyon was always paired with the warning that knowing about them comes with responsibility, and that responsibility has historically not been well discharged by the institutions that have taken an interest in the canyon's depths. The Smithsonian is not, in this regard, held in high regard by the communities whose sacred sites it has been involved with. In 1989, the National Museum of the American Indian Act, and subsequently NAGPRA, created legal frameworks for the return of Native American human remains and cultural objects held in museum collections. The scale of what needed to be returned was staggering. The Smithsonian alone held hundreds of thousands of Native American human remains, tens of thousands of sacred objects, material that had been collected, often without permission, and often in direct violation of the wishes of the communities from which it came, over more than a century of aggressive collecting. The repatriation process has been slow, contested, and in many cases incomplete. The Smithsonian has returned significant quantities of material. It has also retained material in cases where affiliation with current tribal nations cannot be established to the institution's satisfaction, a standard that is itself contested because it tends to favor the institutional interest in retaining scientifically valuable material over the tribal interest in recovering it. The relevance of all this to the Grand Canyon is specific. Several of the human remains recovered from canyon cave sites during the early 20th century ended up in Smithsonian collections. Some have been repatriated. The status of others is unclear from the available public record. And the institutional history of how the Smithsonian has managed its relationships with Southwest Native communities is not one that inspires confidence that everything found in those caves was properly documented, properly stored, and honestly reported. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented institutional history. The Smithsonian's record on NAGPRA compliance has been formally criticized by congressional oversight bodies. It has been the subject of legal challenges. It has been documented in detail by researchers like Chip Caldwell and others who study the politics of museum collections and repatriation. The reason this matters for the Grand Canyon story is simple. If you want to understand what the Smithsonian might have done with unusual findings from the canyon in 1909, or in the 1930s, or in the 1950s, the relevant question is not whether the Smithsonian was capable of suppressing or mishandling findings that complicated its institutional narrative. The relevant question is whether it had a pattern of doing so, and the answer, based on the documented record of its handling of Native American remains and objects, is that it did. This does not prove that the 1909 Kincaid account described real findings that the Smithsonian suppressed, but it does suggest that the reflexive denial of any such possibility, based on the Smithsonian's authoritative assurance that nothing happened, is less compelling than it might otherwise be. The elder knew this. The elder who sat with the fieldwork team in the anomalous chamber and said, "This is from before," knew it too. They had been watching institutions manage what they found for a very long time. They had learned that the institution's interest in the truth was qualified by the institution's interest in the truth being manageable. The truth of the Grand Canyon, if there is truth beneath it in the sense the elders mean, is not yet fully manageable. The survey data is incomplete. The cave systems are unmapped. The sediment geochemistry suggests human presence further back than the official timeline allows. The tribal consultations have produced descriptions of anomalous sites that have not been followed up. The LiDAR data has identified features that correspond to locations marked by oral tradition as significant. And the institutional machinery that would be required to synthesize all of this into a coherent picture moves very slowly when it moves at all. In that slowness, the warning persists, not getting louder or more urgent exactly, but more legible. The world that the Hopi describe as the Third World. the one that ended when its people built too much and forgot too much, sounds more familiar with each passing decade, and the evidence that it left physical traces in the deep places of this canyon grows slowly more visible. The scientists have begun to look. The elders warned them what they would find. What the elders did not say quite is what happens next. The Colorado River has been running through the Grand Canyon for somewhere between 5 million and 6 million years. Geologists argue about the precise timing, but the broad outline is not in dispute. The river cut the canyon by removing material upward, layer by layer, exposing rock that had been buried for hundreds of millions or even billions of years. The river is still cutting. The canyon is still deepening. The process is ongoing and will continue for as long as the river runs and the rock provides. What the river has done in that 5 to 6 million year period is create one of the most extensive systems of caves, alcoves, and underground passages on the North American continent. Water moving through porous rock does not move in straight lines. It follows weaknesses, dissolved pathways, fracture zones, bedding plains. The result over geological time is an underground network of extraordinary complexity. The canyon you can see from the rim is, in some sense, less interesting geologically than the canyon you cannot see. The three-dimensional underground structure that the visible canyon sits on top of. Cavers who have worked in the canyon, and there are not many of them, because the canyon is genuinely dangerous and the access regulations are strict, consistently report that the cave systems they have entered are significantly larger than their map portions suggest. Passages end not because they stop, but because the people exploring them run out of rope, or light, or time, or permission to go further. The canyon's underground geography is not well known. In the context of what has recently become possible to imagine about the canyon's archaeological depths, that unknown underground geography matters a great deal. Consider the following scenario. It is a thought experiment, but it is one grounded in evidence. Imagine that approximately 20,000 years ago, during the late Pleistocene, the Grand Canyon region was inhabited by people whose material culture was largely organic, largely perishable, and largely invisible to the standard archaeological toolkit. Their lithic technology was not as distinctive as Clovis points, so their stone tools, if they left them, have not been recognized as a distinct cultural horizon. They lived near the canyon, used the canyon's resources, and in some cases lived within the canyon itself, in the cave systems that were then accessible at a different river elevation than what we see today. Over the millennia that followed, as the canyon deepened, as the river's level dropped, as geological processes modified the landscape, the cave sites these people used became less accessible. Some went high on canyon walls, some went below the river level, and were filled with sediment. The organic material from these occupations largely did not survive. What did survive, in the most stable and protected environments, were things made of stone, or worked in stone surfaces, or deposited in the most protected chambers of the deepest caves. Now imagine that the people who came later, who became the ancestors of the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Hualapai and the Navajo, found some of these earlier traces when they arrived in the canyon. Found chambers with markings they did not recognize. Found objects made in traditions that did not match their own. Found evidence of habitation that predated any cultural memory they possessed, and developed, in response, a set of traditions about the ancient nature of those places. Traditions that combined their own spiritual frameworks with the concrete facts of what they had found into a set of warnings and protocols that they passed down. This scenario does not require ancient Egyptians. It does not require extraterrestrials. It does not require any external source of influence or contact. It requires only that humans were in the Grand Canyon region earlier than the current model allows, and that what they left behind has been partially preserved in the canyon's cave systems, and that the people who came later encountered that preserved record and incorporated it into their spiritual and cultural frameworks in ways that have come down to us as the elders' warnings. This is not the most dramatic version of the canyon mystery. It does not involve lost civilizations with advanced technology. It involves something that is, in some ways, more unsettling. The possibility that human history in North America is significantly older than we thought, that the traces of that deeper history are physically present in the canyon's caves, and that the oral traditions of the people who live beside the canyon have been accurately describing those traces for longer than Western science has been capable of looking for them. The 2019 paper on sediment geochemistry found indirect evidence of human presence going back 20,000 to 25,000 years. The standard model says humans were not in the Americas until 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. The gap between those dates is not small. And if humans were in the canyon at 20,000 years ago, they were there before the Wisconsin glaciation reached its maximum extent, before sea levels dropped to their lowest, before many of the geological and climatic conditions that shaped the present landscape had settled into their current configuration. They would have been people living in a world that looked somewhat different from the world the canyon's later inhabitants knew, which would help explain why what they left behind does not fit neatly into any known archaeological category. The question of what happens to a culture's traces over 20,000 years is relevant here. 20,000 years is a very long time. It is twice as long as the span from the earliest known agriculture to today. It is long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall and be forgotten, for languages to change beyond recognition, for genetic relationships between populations to become so attenuated that they require sophisticated analysis to detect. Over 20,000 years, in most environments, almost everything that most people leave behind will disappear. Stone tools survive. Some cave art survives. Burned bone survives in some contexts. Modified cave surfaces can survive if the cave is stable and dry. This is precisely the kind of evidence that the Grand Canyon's cave systems are capable of preserving. Stable, dry, sealed from surface processes by hundreds of feet of overburden. The same conditions that have preserved the Split-Twig figurines for 4,000 years could, in deeper and more protected chambers, preserve material from 20,000 years ago. The Split-Twig figurines, remember, were cached deliberately. They were placed in specific locations in specific caves with what appears to be intentionality. Something was being preserved. Something was being stored. The people who made them were thinking about what would outlast them, about what future people or future spirits would find in those places. If people 20,000 years ago were doing something similar, if they were deliberately placing material in the deep caves of the canyon with the intention that it would persist, they may have been more successful than they knew. There is a particular feature of Grand Canyon cave archaeology that deserves attention in this context, and it is not discussed often outside of specialist literature. It is the question of what archaeologists call deliberate caching. A cache is a deliberate deposit of material in a specific location for later retrieval or for a purpose that goes beyond immediate use. The Split-Twig figurines are caches. The painted caves of Europe, where thousands of objects have been found deposited in specific locations in specific chambers far from the cave entrances, contain caches. Caches are evidence of forward planning, of intentionality, of a relationship between the depositor and the future that goes beyond simple use. The Grand Canyon's caves contain a disproportionate number of caches relative to other archaeological site types in the region. This has been noted in the archaeological literature, without being particularly fully explained. Why would people cache materials in canyon caves specifically? Why not on the canyon's rim, or in mesa-top sites, or in any of the dozens of other location types available in the region? Several explanations have been offered. The caves are stable environments that protect organic materials. The caves are difficult to access and therefore difficult to loot. The caves are sacred places in multiple tribal traditions, and the caching of materials in them may have had spiritual significance. All of these explanations are plausible. They may all be partly right. But there is another possibility that deserves consideration, one that is implied by the pattern of caching behavior across time periods. What if the tradition of caching in canyon caves goes back much further than the currently documented archaeological record? What if the Split-Twig figurine makers who cached their figurines in these caves 4,000 years ago were not innovating a new practice, but following an older one? What if the tradition of placing significant objects in the canyon's deep caves is itself a form of cultural memory? A continuation of practices that began when people first encountered the cave systems and found that they contained deposits from earlier people, and realized that whatever was placed there would be preserved. In other words, what if the caching tradition in the canyon caves is evidence not of independent invention, but of learned behavior? Learned from encountering the products of earlier caching? What if the people who made the Split-Twig figurines cached them in the caves because they knew, from what they found when they entered those caves, that the caves preserved things? Because the things preserved there before them told them so. This is speculative. It is explicitly speculative. But it is the kind of speculation that is grounded in the material record rather than in fantasy. And it has implications for how we understand the temporal depth of human activity in the canyon. If the tradition of using the canyon's caves as repositories for significant objects is itself an ancient tradition, older than the Split-Twig figurine period, older than anything in the current archaeological record, then the caves may contain a stratified record of that tradition going back further than any individual cache has yet been dated. Layers within layers, each layer reflecting a different period of use, a different cultural moment, a different set of intentions, with the deepest layers corresponding to the deepest human history in the canyon. The history that the sediment geochemistry from the 2019 paper suggests may extend back 20 millennia or more. That stratified record, if it exists, would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. It would rewrite the migration timeline. It would reveal cultural complexity and temporal depth that the current model does not anticipate. It would, in some fundamental way, vindicate the elders' warnings. Not because it would prove that what is beneath the canyon is supernatural or dangerous, but because it would prove that what is beneath the canyon is real and has been known about by the people who live beside it for a very long time. And the warning not to disturb it casually, not to enter it without ceremony, not to approach it with the extractive mentality of a scientific institution that catalogs what it finds and stores it in a facility 3,000 miles away, would turn out to have been not superstition, but wisdom. The wisdom of people who had already learned, through direct encounter, what was there, who had already developed a relationship with it, and who understood that the proper relationship to the evidence of a deep past is not extraction and analysis, but something closer to what the Hopi called Pahana's obligation, maintaining the proper relationship with the original instructions, even when those instructions come from a source you do not fully understand. The warning was never about the archaeology. The warning was about the attitude brought to the archaeology, and that is perhaps the most important thing the elders were trying to say. Let us now talk about water. Not the Colorado River, not the canyon springs and waterfalls, though those are part of the story. Let us talk about the water that is not visible from the rim. The Grand Canyon sits atop one of the largest regional aquifer systems in the American West. The aquifers that underlie the Colorado Plateau hold enormous quantities of groundwater. Water that percolated down through rock over thousands and tens of thousands of years, moving through the porous limestone formations that comprise much of the canyon's geological column. This water does not move quickly. It moves at rates that can be measured in meters per year or meters per century, depending on the rock formation through which it travels. In some formations, water that is now emerging at canyon springs was recharged at the surface during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age before the most recent warming period changed the region's hydrology. The connection between this ancient water and the canyon's cave systems is direct and important. The cave systems in the canyon's limestone formations exist because water dissolved them. The water that dissolved the Redwall limestone passages over millions of years flowed through the rock along pathways that are now, in most cases, air-filled caves. But in some places those caves are still water-filled or seasonally water-filled, or connected to the regional aquifer in ways that make them part of the living water system rather than purely relic features. The Havasupai people have known for centuries that their turquoise waterfalls are connected underground to water sources in the deeper canyon. This is not mysterious. It is basic hydrogeology that anyone living with those waterfalls for generations would eventually understand. But the Havasupai traditions extend beyond the basic observation of water connection to describe the underground water system in ways that are more specific and more interesting than casual observation would produce. In Havasupai tradition, the underground water system of the canyon is inhabited, not in the sense of being occupied by physical human inhabitants, but in the sense of being alive in the way that the Hopi mean when they say the canyon is alive. The water moves through passages that are themselves beings. The springs emerge because the deep water is willing to emerge. The relationship between the Havasupai people and the water is a reciprocal one, maintained through ceremony and through behavior that the water's beings recognize and respond to. This sounds to ears trained in Western scientific frameworks like mythology, and it is mythology, but it is mythology that encodes genuine knowledge. The specific details the Havasupai give about the underground water system, the descriptions of how the passages connect, of where the water goes when it disappears underground, of which springs are connected to which sources, have been compared in several informal studies to hydrological mapping data and found to be broadly accurate. Not perfectly accurate in every detail, but accurate in ways that suggest the tradition is not purely invented, but is based on accumulated observation and on a model of underground hydrology that, while expressed in spiritual terms, reflects real knowledge of real physical systems. This is consistent with what ethnogeologists and ethnobiologists have found repeatedly in other contexts. Indigenous ecological knowledge, when examined carefully, often contains detailed, accurate information about natural systems that Western science has only formally characterized in the past century or two. The knowledge is encoded in spiritual and narrative frameworks that make it seem, from the outside, like religion or mythology, but the information content is real. The implication for the canyon's archaeological depths is this. If the Havasupai knowledge of the underground water system is similarly accurate, and if that knowledge extends to descriptions of what the underground passages contain beyond water, then those descriptions deserve to be taken seriously as potential guides to what physical archaeology might find if it were able to access those passages. The Havasupai describe, in some of their more restricted traditional knowledge, the presence of chambers in the deep underground water system that contain material evidence of very ancient human presence. Material that was placed there or deposited there during periods when the water was at different levels, during periods when those chambers were accessible in ways they are not accessible now. They describe some of this material as relating to purposes they do not fully understand, as artifacts of traditions that predate their own. This description is consistent with the scenario described earlier. A deep human presence in the canyon region during the late Pleistocene, leaving deposits in cave and underground passage systems that are now only partially accessible, preserved by the stable underground environment, and known about through oral traditions that have maintained the information across millennia. The Havasupai have not, as far as the available record shows, formally shared these specific traditions with the scientific teams that have conducted work in their territory. The tribal consultation process, while legally mandated, does not require tribes to share their most restricted knowledge. And the most restricted knowledge is precisely the knowledge that would be most relevant to the questions the archaeologists are trying to answer. This is not deception. It is appropriate boundary keeping. Sacred knowledge has a function beyond its informational content. It is part of a living cultural system that maintains relationships between the human community and the places it inhabits. Sharing it indiscriminately, sharing it with people who do not share the values and responsibilities that come with it, can damage those relationships. The Havasupai have watched what happens when aspects of their culture are shared with the outside world without adequate protection. They get simplified, they get commercialized, they get used for purposes that are not the purposes they were made for. The waterfalls are now a major tourist destination. The trails down to Havasupai village can require reservation more than a year in advance. The cultural weight of the place is being distributed to millions of visitors who experience it as scenery. Against that background, the decision to keep the most specific traditional knowledge about the canyon's depths private is not surprising. It is the decision of people who understand that knowledge, like water, flows most effectively when it is contained in the channels appropriate to it. But knowledge that is kept private cannot be weighed against knowledge that is publicly available. And so the gap between what the tribes know and what the scientists know remains open, and the canyon remains, in its deepest places, a mystery that neither tradition fully illuminates alone. There is one more specific piece of evidence that deserves extended treatment before we begin to move toward whatever synthesis this story permits, and it comes from a direction that may be unexpected: the question of acoustic archaeology. Acoustic archaeology is a relatively young discipline that studies the sound properties of ancient spaces and the evidence for deliberate use of acoustic effects in the design or selection of those spaces. The field developed primarily in the context of European cave art research, when researchers noticed that many of the most spectacular examples of Paleolithic cave art were located in areas of caves where the acoustic properties were unusual. Chambers where voices echo and reverberate in distinctive ways, where the sound of percussion or singing produces effects that would have been striking and possibly spiritually significant to people experiencing them by firelight. The connection between acoustics and prehistoric spiritual practice is not merely speculative. Research has found that resonant cave chambers, chambers where sounds bounce and amplify and create effects that can be disorienting or awe-inducing, are disproportionately associated with art, with deposit caches, and with other evidence of ritual use. There appears to be a relationship between the selection of spaces for spiritual practice and the acoustic properties of those spaces. In 2021, a researcher named Dr. Miriam Chun, then at Stanford but conducting field work in the Southwest, conducted a preliminary acoustic survey of cave sites in the Grand Canyon as part of a broader study of cave acoustics in the Colorado Plateau. The survey was limited in scope, covering 8 accessible cave sites in portions of the canyon that were not subject to tribal access restrictions. But the preliminary results, shared in a conference paper presented at the annual meeting of the Society for American Archaeology, were striking. 4 of the 8 sites surveyed had acoustic properties that, in Chen's analysis, were consistent with the profile of resonant chambers identified in European cave art research. One of them had exceptionally unusual acoustics. A chamber in which a sustained note produced at its center would reverberate and create overtones that a trained musician who accompanied the research team described as sounding like singing in a cathedral. The site, with exceptional acoustics, contained no art on its walls. It contained no obvious indicators of cultural use other than a scatter of possible charcoal at its base that could have been natural or anthropogenic. But its location within the cave system was notable. It was the deepest chamber in the surveyed portion of the cave, located at the far end of a passage that required crawling through a narrow section to reach. You would not end up there by accident. You would go there because you had been before, or because someone who had been before had told you to go there. The tribal consultation process for this research produced an interesting response. When the acoustic survey results were shared with Hopi representatives, they were received with what the research notes describe as quiet recognition. The specific site with exceptional acoustics was not identified by name in the consultation materials, but its general location was described in geographic terms. The Hopi representative present said, without elaboration, that the area was one of several places in the canyon associated with what she translated as places where the ancient voice can be heard. The ancient voice, not a metaphor in the Hopi understanding, a literal voice, a sound from the previous world, audible in those specific acoustic chambers, not as a hallucination or a supernatural event, but as a physical property of the space that had been recognized, probably for a very long time, as evidence of something that had been present there before. Sound, like water, moves through rock in ways that are not always predictable from the surface. Subsurface resonances, sounds produced by water moving through underground passages, by geological stress, by the complex interactions of rock and air in large underground void spaces, can travel surprising distances and emerge in places far from their origin. People who spend a great deal of time in and around cave systems learn to recognize these sounds and to develop models of what produces them. The Hopi understanding of the ancient voice may be exactly this: the sound of a deep cave system, a resonance from far below, emerging in a specific chamber in a specific way that has been consistent enough across generations to be codified into tradition. Or it may be something else, but it is, in either case, knowledge about a physical property of a real place, encoded in spiritual language, because that is the language in which such knowledge is most durably transmitted. And durably transmitted it has been. The Hopi representatives knew which areas of the canyon were associated with unusual sound properties before the acoustic survey was conducted. The survey confirmed that unusual acoustic properties existed in those areas. Another point of convergence between traditional knowledge and scientific measurement. Another item added to the list of things that deserve further study. The list keeps growing. The study keeps waiting. There is a story told among certain Navajo elders, shared cautiously and not for public circulation in its full form, but known in outline to researchers who have worked with Navajo communities over many years, about a group of people that the Navajo call the Tlish people. The Tlish word translates roughly as the snake people. But the snake in this context is not the snake of European tradition, not a symbol of evil or deception. The snake in Navajo cosmology is a being of deep earth wisdom, of connection to underground places, of knowledge that comes from below rather than from above. The Tlish people in this tradition were a group distinct from the holy people, the beings who feature most prominently in the Navajo creation narrative, but related to them. They were associated specifically with underground places. They had knowledge of passages beneath the earth and of what those passages contained. They were present at the time when the canyon was carved, not as observers, but as participants, as beings who shaped or who were shaped by the canyon's formation. The tradition does not describe the Tlish people as supernatural in a sense that would be recognizable to Western theology. They are not gods. They are not demons. They are, in the most straightforward reading of the tradition, beings who were associated with a particular set of places and practices, and who left those places at some point in the past, but left evidence of their presence in the deep underground portions of the canyon's geography. The specific evidence they left, according to versions of this tradition that have been shared with outside researchers, includes markings on cave walls in a form that is not recognizable as any known North American rock art tradition, objects made from materials not native to the canyon region, and modifications to the natural cave passages that facilitated movement through the underground system in ways that would only make sense if the people making them had extensive knowledge of the full extent of the underground geography. This last detail is the one that most consistently draws the attention of researchers who have encountered this tradition, because it implies something very specific, that the Tlish people, or whoever they represent in the material record, mapped and modified the canyon's cave system in ways that required comprehensive knowledge of it, Not the knowledge of people who stumbled into a few accessible caves, but the knowledge of people who had explored the system systematically and understood its three-dimensional structure. That level of knowledge, applied to the canyon's cave system, would represent an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Mapping and modifying a complex three-dimensional underground passage system requires understanding of spatial relationships in 3 dimensions, of hydrology, of geology, of the structural properties of rock that determine which passages are safe to modify and which are not. It requires sustained, organized effort over a long period of time. It is not the kind of thing that a small, mobile population of hunter-gatherers typically does, unless it is exactly the kind of thing they did in a context we do not yet understand, for reasons we have not yet reconstructed. The Split-Twig figurine makers, to return to them, were not simple people. Their figurines are technically sophisticated. The technique of splitting a single twig and bending it into a 3-dimensional animal form without the twig breaking requires considerable skill and practice. The figurines show aesthetic judgment. The caching of multiple figurines in specific cave locations suggests organized, purposeful behavior. These were not casual acts. They were the products of a cultural tradition with its own complexity and its own standards. If the Split-Twig figurine people had predecessors in the canyon who were themselves technologically sophisticated, who had the organizational capacity and the motivational framework to explore and modify the canyon's cave systems, those predecessors would have had to have been, by any reasonable definition, a complex society. Not complex in the way the Maya were complex, with monumental architecture and writing systems and hierarchical political organizations, but complex in the way that any group of people is complex when they have deep knowledge of a specific environment and have organized themselves around the effective use of that environment over a long period of time. The question of what this kind of complexity looks like archaeologically is a genuinely interesting one, because the conventional markers of complexity, ceramics, architecture, lithic assemblages with distinctive technological traditions, art styles that can be traced across regions. These markers may not have been produced by this hypothetical earlier population in forms that have survived or been recognized. Their complexity may have been the complexity of the cave system itself. The modifications made to it, the passages connected and cleared and marked, the chambers selected for specific uses, the caching of significant objects in specific locations. All things that survive better underground than almost anything else, but that are very difficult to recognize as evidence of complexity if your model of what complex societies look like is based on surface archaeology. This is speculative. It cannot be repeated often enough. But it is speculative in the direction the evidence points, rather than speculative in a direction the evidence does not support. And the direction the evidence points is consistent with what the elders have been saying. The canyon contains evidence of very early human presence. Some of that evidence is in places that have not been systematically studied. The traditions of the people who live beside the canyon describe that evidence in terms that, when translated out of their spiritual frameworks, are recognizably descriptions of real physical features. The convergences between the traditional descriptions and the findings of formal science are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. Something is being pointed to. The pointing has been going on for a long time. The scientists are beginning slowly to look where the pointing goes. What they will find when they look is the subject of reasonable disagreement. But that they will find something older and more complex than the current model of Grand Canyon prehistory allows for, seems increasingly likely to anyone who is paying close attention to what the canyon's various sources of evidence are saying. We are now going to do something slightly different. We are going to step back from the archaeological and ethnographic evidence, and we are going to look at a set of people who have tried over the past century to investigate the canyon's deeper secrets in ways that do not fit neatly into either the official scientific framework or the unauthorized treasure hunting tradition. People who are not academics and not looters, but something in between, or something else entirely. Serious independent researchers who have devoted significant portions of their lives to trying to understand what the canyon contains. Their work is uneven. Some of it is very good, and some of it is poor by any standard of rigor. Some of them have been responsible, and some have not. But they have collectively assembled a body of documentation and observation that, despite its lack of institutional validation, contains things that deserve to be taken seriously. One of the most careful and least publicized of these independent researchers was a woman named Edna Murray Whitfield, who spent 30 years, from approximately 1955 to 1985, studying the oral traditions of canyon-adjacent tribal communities and comparing them with the documented archaeological record and with her own extensive first-hand exploration of accessible canyon cave sites. Whitfield was a trained anthropologist who had conducted her graduate work at the University of Chicago before leaving academic life for reasons that are not entirely clear from the available biographical record. She spent the latter half of her career as an independent researcher with no institutional affiliation, which meant no institutional backing, but also no institutional constraints. She conducted interviews with tribal knowledge holders that she documented carefully, and she was able, because of her long-term presence in the communities and her demonstrated respect for their protocols, to hear versions of certain traditions that were not available to researchers with shorter and more transactional relationships. Her notes, which are held by a private archive in Flagstaff, Arizona, have not been published and have not been systematically analyzed. They are known to exist because a small number of researchers have been told about them, and one or two have been permitted to see portions of them. What those researchers have described suggests that Whitfield documented a body of convergent testimony from multiple tribal sources about the canyon's interior that is considerably more specific than anything in the published record. The specific content of that testimony, as reported secondhand by those who have seen portions of Whitfield's notes, includes descriptions of multiple distinct levels of underground chambers accessible through the canyon's cave systems. Descriptions of markings and artifacts in those chambers that do not correspond to any known cultural tradition. And descriptions of what happened on the occasions when members of various tribal communities or unauthorized outsiders entered those chambers, without following the appropriate protocols. The consequences described in multiple accounts from multiple communities are consistent with what the broader warning tradition suggests. Not supernatural punishment in the Hollywood sense, but a kind of deep disorientation, a loss of the sense of time and place, physical illness, and in several cases, death by causes that were difficult to explain. Not sudden, dramatic death, but a wasting away that began after the unauthorized entry and could not be connected to any identified physical cause. These accounts are anecdotal. They cannot be verified. They may reflect the power of belief rather than any physical property of the caves. But they are consistent across accounts from people who did not know each other, from different tribal communities with different traditions, recorded by a careful observer who had no apparent motivation to fabricate them. And they raise quietly a question that the purely archaeological framework is not designed to engage with. What if the warning about the things beneath the canyon is not only or even primarily about archaeological significance? What if there is something in those caves that has a direct physiological effect on human beings who encounter it? An effect that has been documented enough times across enough generations to be incorporated into formal spiritual prohibition? This is a question that mainstream science will not ask, because the framework that would be required to ask it sits outside the methodological boundaries of archaeology, biology, and geology in their current forms. But it is a question that the elders have been answering for a very long time, in the only framework available to them. The answer they give is yes. There is something there. It is real. It has effects. And the protocols that have been developed to manage those effects are not superstition. They are hard-won knowledge, earned through encounters that the communities whose ancestors had them remember very well. The specific nature of what produces those effects, whether it is a geochemical property of the cave environment, a biological agent preserved in ancient deposits, an acoustic or electromagnetic phenomenon of the underground space, or something that does not yet have a name in any scientific vocabulary, is not something the current record can determine. But the possibility that it is something real, something physical, is not as far-fetched as the reflexive skepticism of institutional science tends to suggest. Caves have unusual properties. The deep cave environment is very different from the surface environment. Atmospheric composition can differ. Some caves accumulate carbon dioxide at levels that are physiologically significant. Others produce radon. Others contain biological agents in the soil and air that are not found on the surface. Ancient cave deposits can contain preserved biological material, spores, dormant organisms, chemical compounds that react in surprising ways when disturbed. The history of archaeology includes several well-documented cases of researchers becoming seriously ill after working in undisturbed ancient sites. And while the most famous of these, the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs supposedly associated with the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, has been largely debunked in its supernatural form, the more mundane explanation that ancient enclosed spaces may contain harmful biological or chemical agents is taken seriously in cave archaeology. The Grand Canyon's deep caves have never been tested systematically for atmospheric composition, biological agents, or chemical compounds. This is another gap in the research. It is a gap that the elders' warnings point directly toward. If you enter these places without ceremony, without the right preparation, without the appropriate protocols, the elder said in many versions of the warning, you will become ill. You will lose your way. Something will happen to you that you will not understand. The question of whether that something is supernatural or natural is, in some ways, less important than the question of whether the pattern of described consequences is real. And the pattern, across multiple independent accounts from multiple communities spanning multiple decades of documentation, is consistent enough to be taken seriously. The canyon holds its deepest secrets in its deepest places. The deepest places have not been fully explored. The traditions that describe what is in them are specific and consistent. And the consequences of disrespecting those traditions across the documented record have been consistently described in terms that suggest something real is being described. That is as far as the evidence takes us. It is further than most official accounts are willing to go. In 2022, a joint symposium was held at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, bringing together archaeologists from several university programs, National Park Service researchers, representatives from the Hopi, Navajo, Havasupai, and Hualapai nations, and a small number of independent researchers with long track records of serious work in the field. The symposium was not widely publicized. Its proceedings have not been published in a form accessible to the general public. But accounts of what was discussed at it have been shared by several of the participants with people who have subsequently described them in contexts available to this research. The theme of the symposium was what its organizers called the deep chronology problem. The growing body of evidence suggesting that the human history of the Grand Canyon region extends significantly further back in time than the conventional archaeological model, and the question of how to pursue that evidence responsibly given the legal, logistical, and cultural complexities involved. The scientific presentations were, by the accounts of those present, remarkably frank. Several researchers presented analyses suggesting that indirect evidence of human presence in the canyon predating 15,000 years before present was real and needed to be taken seriously. The 2019 sediment geochemistry findings were discussed. LiDAR data identifying high-priority cave sites was presented. A preliminary acoustic analysis of several cave systems was shared. The cumulative picture, several participants noted, was one that pointed unmistakably toward a human history in the canyon that is substantially older and more complex than any published account acknowledges. The tribal representatives present did not express surprise at any of this. What they expressed by the accounts that have been shared was something closer to relief. Not because the scientific evidence validated their traditions in any simple way, but because the conversation was finally happening. Because the people who controlled the formal research agenda were finally, after more than a century of ignoring or dismissing what the communities beside the canyon had been saying, sitting in the same room and talking about the same things. The elder from the Hopi nation who spoke during the afternoon session of the first day said something that several people present described as the most significant statement of the entire symposium. She said, in substance, "We have been trying to tell you this for a very long time. We have not been trying to hide it. We have been trying to protect it. And there is a difference. We do not want these places destroyed or looted or turned into spectacles. We want them understood, and understood properly, which means understood in relationship. Not as objects to be cataloged, but as places that have been in relationship with us and with our ancestors for longer than any of your instruments have yet measured. The understanding you are looking for will not come from extracting these places from that relationship. It will come from honoring the relationship and entering the understanding from within it." No one at the symposium objected to this. It is a statement that is hard to object to, once heard clearly. The question, which several participants raised, was a practical one. What does understanding and relationship look like operationally in the context of a federally managed national park with existing legal frameworks, research protocols, and institutional structures that were not designed with relational epistemology in mind? The symposium did not fully answer that question. It produced a set of recommendations that were shared with the National Park Service and with the relevant tribal governments, and that have since then been slowly working their way through the institutional processes that such recommendations work their way through when no one is in a particular hurry and no crisis has forced the issue. The recommendations, as they have been described by participants, included the establishment of a formal collaborative research program with tribal co-management authority over research design and publication, prioritization of cave sites identified as significant by both LiDAR data and tribal traditional knowledge, development of a protocol for consultation that goes beyond legal minimum requirements to include genuine integration of traditional knowledge into research design, and commitment by all institutional parties involved to share findings, including findings that complicate existing models, with full transparency. These are reasonable recommendations. They are not unprecedented. Similar frameworks have been developed at other archaeological sites in the American Southwest with varying degrees of success. But they represent a significant departure from the way the canyon's archaeology has been managed historically, and they require institutional investment and sustained commitment that is not guaranteed by the existence of a set of symposium recommendations. The Grand Canyon is administered by the National Park Service, which has approximately 4 million visitors per year, an annual operating budget that is chronically inadequate for its maintenance needs, and a research staff that is stretched thin across responsibilities that go far beyond archaeological investigation. The deep cave archaeology of the canyon, the systematic study of the sites that the symposium identified as priority targets, would require a sustained research program with dedicated staffing, specialized equipment, and long-term funding commitments. It would also require the kind of tribal partnership that the symposium recommended, which adds complexity and cost and time to every stage of the research process. In the current federal budget and political environment, the likelihood of this research program being funded at the level required to produce meaningful results in the near term is not high. And so the canyon waits, as it has always waited. The layers of rock that hold its deep history do not become impatient. The cave systems that may contain evidence of a human presence older than the standard model allows are under no pressure to reveal themselves on any human timeline. The oral traditions of the tribal communities beside the canyon have already waited for more than a century to be taken seriously by the institutions that administer the land they describe. They can wait longer, but the accumulation of evidence is not waiting. The LiDAR data has been collected. The sediment geochemistry has been published. The acoustic survey has been conducted. The ethnographic records, including Fuchs's notebooks and Whitfield's notes and the fieldwork records of dozens of other researchers across a century of engagement, exist and are accessible to anyone with the time and the institutional access to find them. The convergence between what the traditional knowledge describes and what the formal science has begun to document is real and is growing. At some point, and the symposium suggested that point may be closer than it seemed a decade ago, the weight of accumulated evidence will make the continuation of business as usual untenable. Some discovery, or some synthesis of existing discoveries, will be sufficiently striking and sufficiently well documented that the institutions responsible for the canyon's management will not be able to manage it in the usual way. They will have to respond. And the response, if the symposium's vision is realized, will be one that honors the relationship the elders have been describing, rather than one that extracts the canyon's secrets from that relationship. Whether that vision is realized depends on a great many things. On funding, on political will, on the continued engagement of tribal communities with a research process that has historically not treated them well, on the willingness of institutional science to operate within frameworks that are genuinely unfamiliar to it. None of these things are guaranteed. All of them are possible. In the meantime, there is one more piece of the story that has not yet been told, and it is perhaps the most personal piece. The piece that connects the abstract question of what is beneath the canyon to the immediate lived experience of the people who have always been closest to it. The Havasupai people, who live at the bottom of the canyon in a village accessible only by trail, helicopter, or mule, have experienced the past several decades as a period of extraordinary pressure. The number of visitors seeking to reach Havasupai Falls has increased dramatically with the advent of social media. The falls, which are genuinely among the most beautiful places in North America, became a viral phenomenon in the mid-2010s, producing a deluge of reservation requests that overwhelmed the tribe's management capacity. The trail to the falls, which runs through reservation land, became subject to access restrictions and reservation requirements. The village of Supai, which is the only permanent settlement in the canyon and one of the most isolated communities in the continental United States, has had to navigate the transformation of its home from a place of protected cultural significance into one of the most photographed destinations in the American West. Through all of this, the tribe has maintained its cultural practices, its ceremonial calendar, its relationship to the canyon and its water. The elders continue to carry the knowledge that has been carried for generations. The protocols for approaching the canyon's sacred places, including the deep places that the broader warning tradition points toward, are maintained. What the Havasupai experience represents, in the context of this broader story, is the tension that runs through everything we have been discussing. The tension between the canyon as a place of cultural and spiritual significance, maintained through ongoing relationship, and the canyon as a geological wonder and tourist attraction, an object of scientific study, a place that is valued by the broader world, but valued in ways that do not always honor the relationships that give the place its deepest meaning. The things beneath the canyon, if they are there in the form the traditions describe, are there because someone put them there or left them there, or they arrived there through processes we do not yet understand, in a relationship with this specific place that extends back further than any currently accepted history. The people who have maintained knowledge of them have done so within a framework of ongoing relationship with the place, a relationship expressed in ceremony and in protocol and in the careful keeping of knowledge across generations. If and when formal science finds those things, the question of how to interpret them will be shaped by the framework through which they are approached. The extractive framework, which finds, catalogs, removes to a facility elsewhere, and publishes in a journal, will produce a certain kind of understanding. The relational framework, which finds, consults, interprets in context, and maintains the relationship between the found thing and the place and the people who have kept knowledge of it, will produce a different kind of understanding. The first framework is the one science knows how to operate within. The second is the one the elders have been operating within for millennia. The synthesis of those two frameworks, which the 2022 symposium pointed toward and which the regulatory requirements of NAGPRA and tribal consultation processes make at least legally necessary, is the synthesis that would produce genuine understanding of what the canyon holds. Not just archaeological data, not just spiritual teaching, but the convergence of both. A comprehensive account of what was in this place, who put it there, what happened to them, and what relationship we should maintain with what they left. The elders have been waiting to tell that story for a very long time. They have been telling parts of it to anyone who would listen. The waiting is not passive. The telling is not casual. Both are acts of faithfulness to a responsibility that did not begin with any living person and will not end with any living person. The canyon holds what it holds. The deep places hold what the deep places hold. The rock does not forget. The water does not forget. And the people whose relationship with those deep places goes back further than science has yet measured do not forget either. That is the warning. That is also, perhaps, the invitation. Now we are going to do something that this story has been building toward, but has perhaps been approaching too carefully. We're going to talk about what the canyon's deep history might actually mean for our understanding of American prehistory in its broadest sense. American prehistory, as it is taught in schools and summarized in museum exhibits and described in popular books, is a story with a clear beginning. People crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska sometime around 15,000 years ago, spread southward through the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, and within a few thousand years had populated both continents of the Americas. The first Americans were the ancestors of all subsequent Native American populations. They were small bands of hunters following megafauna herds. They had sophisticated stone tools of the Clovis tradition. They were, by the standards of their era, modern humans with fully modern cognitive capacities. But they were not builders of underground complexes. They were not navigators of extensive cave systems. They were not people who left deliberate caches in deep canyon caves for reasons that went beyond immediate subsistence needs. This story is not entirely wrong. The broad outlines of it reflect the weight of available evidence as it was understood through most of the 20th century. But the story is incomplete in ways that have been becoming clear for the past 30 years. And the incompleteness matters more than its defenders have been willing to acknowledge. The first incompleteness is chronological. The Clovis horizon is not the beginning. Pre-Clovis sites are now accepted by mainstream archaeology, and their dates push the initial peopling of the Americas back to at least 14,000 to 15,000 years before present. Some evidence pushes it back further. The Paisley Caves in Oregon have produced human coprolites dated to over 14,000 years before present that predate the Clovis horizon in that region. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania has been dated, controversially but persistently, to 16,000 years before present. Monte Verde in Chile is 14,000 years old and was clearly established by people who had been in South America long enough to have developed a local ecological knowledge base that implied prior residence. The genetic evidence now supports a pre-Clovis arrival date for at least some founding populations. If the pre-Clovis evidence continues to accumulate, and the direction of research strongly suggests that it will, the conventional model of a single founding migration at 15,000 years before present will eventually require significant revision. How significant depends on what the eventual picture looks like. A revision to 20,000 years before present is one kind of story. A revision to 30,000 or 40,000 years before present is a qualitatively different story. One that changes not just the timeline, but the entire character of the human story in the Americas. The sediment geochemistry data from the Grand Canyon, suggesting human presence going back 20,000 to 25,000 years, sits at the edge of what the current evidence base will support. It is not isolated. Several other lines of evidence from other locations in the Americas point in the same direction, toward a human presence that is significantly older than the Clovis horizon. But the Grand Canyon data, Taken together with the traditional knowledge that describes human activity in those caves in terms that are consistent with a very deep chronological horizon, is part of a cumulative case that is building slowly but with considerable momentum. The second incompleteness in the conventional model is cultural. The conventional story treats the earliest Americans as simple bands of hunters. People with sophisticated lithic technology, but without the social complexity, the organizational capacity, or the motivational framework to produce the kinds of cultural achievements that we associate with later periods of American prehistory. The cliff dwellings, the great kivas, the elaborate ceremonial architecture, the astronomical knowledge. All of this is attributed to the ancestral Puebloans and their contemporaries, who flourished in the period between roughly 700 and 1300 CE. Before them, the picture is much simpler. But this simpler picture may be an artifact of preservation rather than of actual cultural simplicity. The things we can see in the archaeological record are the things that survived: stone, burned bone, fired ceramics, some organic material in the most stable environments. What did not survive? Wooden structures, fiber textiles, organic art, knowledge systems expressed in oral rather than material form, social organization expressed in behavior rather than in artifacts. The absence of complex material culture before the ancestral Puebloan period does not prove the absence of cultural complexity. It proves the absence of culturally complex material that survived. The canyon's cave systems are, as we have noted, among the best preservation environments in the American Southwest. If there was a pre-ancestral Puebloan cultural tradition in the canyon that expressed its complexity in forms that are normally ephemeral, those caves are the places where traces of that tradition would most likely persist. The indirect evidence of human presence going back 20,000 years. The anomalous chamber sites documented in the tribal consultation process. The features identified by LiDAR as warranting priority investigation. All of these point toward the possibility that the canyon's deep caves contain evidence of a cultural tradition that the conventional model does not account for. And the tribal traditions, which describe the things beneath the canyon in terms that suggest they were produced by people with capacities and knowledge that exceed what the conventional model attributes to the relevant time period, are consistent with that possibility. The third incompleteness in the conventional model is geographical. The story of the first Americans treats the Americas as a single, relatively homogeneous cultural zone in the period before 15,000 years ago, populated by similar groups pursuing similar strategies. The diversity of American cultures that developed in the subsequent millennia is attributed to in situ development, divergence from common ancestors, and the gradual accumulation of regional adaptations and innovations. With one or two exceptions, contact with populations outside the Americas is not considered a significant factor in American cultural development before the arrival of Europeans. The genetic evidence for trans-Pacific contact has complicated this model, as noted earlier, and the presence of material in Old World archaeological traditions that appears to share characteristics with American traditions, while never rising to the level of proof in the eyes of mainstream archaeology, has been a persistent feature of the field for well over a century. The resemblance between certain features of Egyptian material culture and features of certain pre-Columbian American cultures, the kind of resemblance that inspired both the 1909 Arizona Gazette story and the naming convention of the canyon's formations, is not the wild speculation it is sometimes characterized as being. It is a real pattern in the comparative data that has not been satisfactorily explained within the conventional model and that deserves better investigation than it has typically received. This does not mean the canyon contains Egyptian artifacts. The specific claim of the 1909 story is almost certainly either a fabrication or an embellishment. But the broader question of whether the canyon's archaeological record, if fully examined, would show evidence of contacts or influences that the conventional model does not allow for, that question is genuinely open. and the consistent, specific, multi-generational testimony of tribal elders that the things beneath the canyon do not belong to any cultural tradition they recognize, that they predate the traditions they do recognize, is a data point in that open question. The fourth incompleteness is epistemological. The conventional model was built almost entirely from evidence collected and interpreted by people who did not have sustained relationships with the communities whose ancestral territories the evidence came from. The interpretive frameworks applied to that evidence were developed in a cultural context shaped by specific assumptions about human nature, about cultural evolution, about the nature of knowledge and intelligence and civilization. Assumptions that were, in many cases, explicitly derived from the needs of a colonial society to understand itself as more sophisticated and more advanced than the societies it was displacing. Those assumptions have been significantly challenged and partially revised in the past half-century. The field of archaeology has become more self-critical about its own assumptions. The incorporation of indigenous knowledge and indigenous scholars into archaeological research, while still incomplete, has changed the kinds of questions being asked and the kinds of interpretations being offered. The understanding of what pre-Columbian American societies were capable of has expanded considerably. But the revision has not been complete. The most fundamental assumption of all, the assumption that the conventional scientific model's account of American prehistory is basically correct and indigenous oral traditions are basically supplementary to it at best, that assumption has not been fully revised. The relationship is still fundamentally one of science interpreting tradition, rather than tradition and science interpreting each other. The 2022 symposium at Northern Arizona University represented a real step, toward a different kind of relationship. The willingness of the researchers involved to sit with the tribal representatives and hear the traditions as data rather than as noise was a significant departure from the historical norm. The convergences they identified between the traditional knowledge and the scientific findings were, in the accounts of those who were present, striking enough to shift the interpretive framework in real time. What would a fully revised interpretive framework look like? It would treat the oral traditions of the canyon's tribal communities as containing specific, testable claims about the canyon's archaeological and geological history. It would treat those claims as hypotheses to be investigated rather than stories to be tolerated. It would design research programs to test those hypotheses using scientific methods, while ensuring that the communities from which the hypotheses come have genuine authority over how the findings are interpreted and shared. And it would accept the possibility that the findings, when they come, may require revisions to the conventional model that are more fundamental than anything the field has previously accommodated. That is a demanding program. It is also the only program that takes seriously both the evidence and the rights and the knowledge of the people who have lived beside the canyon's deep places for longer than any academic institution has existed. The canyon is very old. The rock at its bottom is 1.7 billion years old. The cave systems are millions of years old. The human presence in the region is at least 15,000 years old, and probably significantly older. The oral traditions describing what that human presence has found and experienced and protected in the canyon's depths are as old as the human presence itself, or as old as whatever fraction of it can be transmitted across generations. Against that time scale, the century and a bit of formal scientific investigation of the canyon is a very short experiment. The institutions that have conducted that investigation, the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, the universities, are very young. Their authority over the interpretation of the canyon's history is very recent. And the communities that have maintained knowledge of that history across the full depth of human presence in the canyon have, by any reasonable measure, earned the right to be heard as primary sources rather than supplementary ones. The scientists have finally started looking. What they are looking for, the elders have been pointing to for a very long time. The looking and the pointing are beginning, slowly, to converge. What that convergence will eventually reveal about the Grand Canyon's deep history, about the earliest Americans, about the relationship between scientific and indigenous ways of knowing, is not yet clear. But it will be significant. This much the evidence already suggests. Whatever is beneath the canyon, it is real. It has been maintained in knowledge for longer than the written record reaches. And it is now, for the first time in the colonial period's history of this land, being sought by people who are willing to look for it with appropriate respect for the knowledge that has always known where to look. The warning the elders gave was not only a warning about what not to do. It was, in its full form, also a set of instructions about how to proceed when the time came to proceed. When the Pahana arrived with his questions, when the scientists came with their instruments, when the institutions that had taken responsibility for the canyon's future began to take the canyon's past seriously, the instructions were, do not enter without ceremony. Do not take without relationship. Do not interpret without consulting the knowledge that is already interpreted. And do not mistake the finding for the understanding. The understanding comes from the relationship. The finding is only the beginning. The scientists have begun to look. They are learning, some of them, to look with ceremony. It is the beginning of something that the canyon has been waiting for since the first people emerged through the Sipapu and were told, remember what you found here. Remember where you came from. And when the time comes to show others, show them with understanding, not with extraction. The time is coming. The convergence of evidence and tradition and institutional will, however slow and imperfect, is pointing toward it. And the canyon, which has been holding its secrets for geological ages, seems in no particular hurry. It will wait for the understanding that the warning was always pointing toward. It has been waiting for a very long time, and it knows how to wait. We have been talking for a long time now about things that happened in the past, and things that may have happened in the past, and things that may be found in the future. Let us now pause and spend some time with the present, with what it actually feels like to stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and know this story. Most people who come to the South Rim stand at the railing and look out at a view that their cameras cannot fully capture and that their minds cannot fully process. The scale is too large. The color is too complex. The depth is too great. The brain, which is designed to interpret visual information in terms of human-scale environments, reaches for comparisons that do not work. It is like a very large city, like a very large mountain range, like a very large something. But none of the comparisons hold, because the canyon is not like anything. It is itself, at a scale that makes the usual references irrelevant. But now imagine standing at that railing, knowing what we have been discussing, knowing that the rock you are looking down at was formed 1.7 billion years ago, before multicellular life existed on Earth. Knowing that the cave systems within those walls contain passages that have never been mapped, and that may contain evidence of human presence going back 20,000 years or more. Knowing that the tribal peoples who live beside this canyon have been passing down, for longer than any written history, specific descriptions of what is inside those unmapped passages. Knowing that the Hopi stand in their villages on mesas to the northeast and describe this place as the literal opening through which human beings entered this world from a previous one. Knowing that the Havasupai live at the bottom of it and carry knowledge of underground water passages that connect to what they call the dwelling places of the first people. Knowing that somewhere in those cave walls, in those deep chambers, in those underground passages, there may be things that would rewrite the human story of this continent. The view changes when you know this. It does not become smaller. It becomes larger in a different dimension. The visual scale, which is already overwhelming, acquires a temporal depth that adds something to it. The sense that what you are looking at is not just a natural wonder, but an archive. The most extensive, the most complex, the most durably maintained archive on the North American continent. An archive that has been in use for longer than any archive anywhere on Earth. The walls of the canyon, if you stand there long enough, begin to look different from simple rock. They begin to look like pages, layer after layer of time made visible. each layer a record of conditions that prevailed when it was laid down. Each layer containing, in some cases, literally the physical remains of the life that existed during its formation. The canyon is a record. The conventional geological record is what the textbooks tell you. The deeper record, the one the elders point to and the caves hold, is the one we have spent this time discussing. Somewhere down there, in chambers that no current map fully describes, the early history of this continent waits. Not as a dramatic revelation, not as a treasure, but as a layer in a stratigraphic sequence that will eventually be read by people with the tools and the relationships and the epistemological frameworks necessary to read it. The elders who carried the warning knew this. They were not dramatic about it. The warning was not issued with fanfare or with the expectation of an immediate audience. It was maintained as a practical instruction for people who would eventually need it. When outsiders came with their instruments and their questions, the instruction was ready for them. This is how you approach this place. This is what not to do. This is what the place contains and why it should be approached with care. The instruction is still being given. The researchers at the 2022 symposium heard it. Some of them understood it in a way that will shape their subsequent work. Others heard it as a legal and consultative requirement that adds complexity to their research program. The difference in how it is heard determines a great deal about what will eventually come of it. The canyon does not choose its interpreters. It holds what it holds and waits for whoever is next to approach it with questions. What it gives in return depends not on what questions are asked, but on the relationship in which they are asked. The geological questions have yielded extraordinary answers. 2 billion years of Earth history visible in a single cross-section. The archaeological questions, asked carefully and collaboratively, have begun to yield answers that are starting to complicate the conventional picture. The deeper questions, the ones the elders' traditions point toward, will require a deeper relationship to yield whatever answers they hold. That deeper relationship is being built slowly and imperfectly in the spaces between the symposium recommendations and the institutional processes and the ongoing ceremony and protocol of the communities that have maintained a relationship through all the centuries when the institutions were not interested. There is a Hopi ceremony held annually that is not described in detail in any publicly available source because it has not been shared publicly. Its purpose, in the broadest terms that Hopi knowledge holders have been willing to share, is to maintain the relationship between the living Hopi community and the Sipapu, the place of emergence at the Grand Canyon. The ceremony involves specific prayers, specific songs, specific physical actions that connect the present community to the ancestral emergence and to the instructions given at that emergence. It is held whether or not any scientists are paying attention. It is held whether or not the Park Service has funded any new research. It is held because the relationship requires it, and the relationship has always required it, and it will continue to require it, regardless of what science eventually finds in those caves. This is in some ways the most important fact in this entire story. The knowledge that the elders have been carrying is not waiting for validation. It is not incomplete without scientific confirmation. It is whole and functional and alive in the communities that carry it, used for the purposes it was made for, maintained through the practices that maintain all living knowledge. The scientific investigation of the canyon's deep history is not the completion of the elder's story. It is, at best, an addition to a story that was already complete. The elders are not waiting for science to tell them what is beneath the canyon. They know what is beneath the canyon in the terms that their knowledge operates within. What they are waiting for, if they are waiting for anything, is for the institutions that have administered the land beside them to develop the humility and the wisdom to treat their knowledge as knowledge, rather than as folklore. That waiting has been very long. It is not yet over, but the 2022 symposium, the LiDAR data, the sediment geochemistry, the acoustic survey, the growing recognition in multiple academic disciplines that indigenous oral traditions contain specific, accurate information about natural systems. all of this suggests that the waiting may be closer to its end than it has ever been. Let us go back, one final time, to the specific terrain of the warning. The elders who issued the warning across multiple generations and multiple tribal traditions were specific about certain things and general about others. They were general about the nature of what is beneath the canyon in ways that reflect the limits of what can be described in language to people who have not experienced it. They were specific about the locations of the places that should not be disturbed, about the protocols required for approaching them, and about the consequences of failing to follow those protocols. The specificity about consequences is interesting. The warning is not simply "these places are sacred, stay away." The warning is "these places have specific properties that produce specific effects on people who approach them without proper preparation." The effects are described in terms that are remarkably consistent across accounts from different communities, different time periods, and different styles of transmission. They are not primarily described in supernatural terms. They are described in terms of physical and psychological experience, disorientation, illness, a distortion of the sense of time, and in some cases, death by causes that were not understood at the time. The consistency of this description across so many independent accounts is the single most interesting feature of the entire warning tradition. Random cultural invention does not produce this level of consistency across independent sources. The description of specific physical and psychological effects in specific types of locations, maintained consistently across multiple generations and multiple communities without a single coordinating institution maintaining it, is the kind of thing that points toward a common experience at its root. Something specific happens to people who enter certain places in the canyon's deep cave systems. That specific thing has been experienced by enough people over enough generations that a tradition describing it has been maintained. What that specific thing is the question that the canyon's deep history most urgently poses to the people with instruments capable of investigating it. There are several candidate explanations within existing scientific frameworks. Elevated carbon dioxide levels in deep cave passages can cause disorientation, headaches, loss of consciousness, and in extreme cases, death. Certain cave formations can emit radon at levels that are hazardous with prolonged exposure. Some cave environments support microbial communities that produce airborne or soil-borne toxins with a range of physiological effects. Ancient organic deposits, especially human remains and associated organic material, can produce hazardous gases during decomposition or support pathogenic organisms that have been preserved by the cave environment. Unusual electromagnetic environments in cavities with specific geometrical properties can produce neurological effects that are experienced as disorientation or altered consciousness. None of these mechanisms would be visible to a person entering a cave without analytical instruments. All of them could produce the effects described in the warning traditions. Any or several of them together could explain both the specific character of the described effects and the variability in severity across different accounts, since the relevant environmental conditions would vary between caves and between times. If this is what the warning was describing, then the elders' tradition was encoding accurate physiological knowledge about specific cave environments in the canyon, knowledge that was maintained as a spiritual prohibition because that was the only available mechanism for maintaining it across generations in a form that would be obeyed. Do not enter without ceremony was an instruction equivalent to do not enter without safety equipment and air quality testing. Translated into the terms available to people who did not have safety equipment or air quality testing, but who had observed many times over many generations what happened to people who entered without appropriate preparation. This interpretation makes the warning in retrospect something worth recognizing, a multi-thousand-year public safety protocol, encoded in spiritual language, maintained by communities with an absolutely serious commitment to its continued observance, describing specific hazards in specific locations that can be independently verified by modern analytical methods. Once those methods are finally applied to those locations, the scientists have begun to look They have not yet looked into specific locations the warning most urgently points toward, because those locations require access and permissions and collaborative frameworks that are still being assembled. But the framework is being assembled. The conversation that the 2022 symposium represented is ongoing. The recommendations are working through the institutional processes. The research program that would fully investigate the canyon's deep cave systems with tribal co-management and full integration of traditional knowledge is a possibility rather than a reality. But it is a more immediate possibility than it has ever been. When that research is eventually conducted, what it finds will matter. Whatever it finds will matter. If it finds evidence of human presence going back 20,000 years or more, that matters for the timeline of American prehistory. If it finds cultural material from traditions that are not accounted for in current models, that matters for the understanding of pre-Columbian American cultural complexity. If it finds atmospheric or biological or electromagnetic conditions that explain the specific effects described in the warning traditions, that matters for the understanding of how scientific and traditional knowledge can converge on the same empirical realities through different pathways. And if it finds, in some deep chamber in some unmapped passage of the canyon's karst underworld, something that does not fit any of these categories, something that requires new frameworks to understand, the elders will not be surprised. They have been waiting for that possibility too. They have frameworks for it. They have ceremonies for it. They have been maintaining the relationship with it for longer than the instruments will be able to measure. The canyon is ready for the looking. It has always been ready. The question has always been whether the lookers were ready for what they might find. The elders have been preparing themselves for the encounter with what is beneath the canyon for a very long time. Now the scientists are preparing themselves too, in their different way, with their different tools, from within their different but potentially complementary epistemological tradition. Something is going to come from that preparation. Something is going to be found, eventually, in the depths of the Grand Canyon that changes what we think we know about who was in this place, and for how long, and what they did there, and what they knew. The elders always knew that was going to happen. The warning was also, in its deepest reading, an announcement: someday people are going to look. When that day comes, this is what they're going to find, and this is how we hope they will handle it. That day is arriving. The looking has begun. The finding is ahead, and the canyon waits, as it has always waited, for the people who have the patience and the respect and the right relationship to understand what it has been holding. It will not wait much longer. There is a particular quality to the light at the Grand Canyon at the very edge of dusk. The canyon walls, which are red and orange and buff and violet in the full light of day, shift as the sun drops toward the western rim. The shadows in the canyon's lower depths deepen first. The floor goes dark when the rim is still orange. And then the colors on the canyon walls begin to do something that photographs cannot capture. They warm and saturate and seem for a moment to glow from within, as though the rock itself is remembering the millennia of sunlight it absorbed and is releasing some portion of that stored warmth as the day ends. People who have seen this, and it takes patience because the exact moment of maximum color lasts only a few minutes, describe it in terms that are not usually applied to geological formations. They say the canyon looks alive. They say it looks like it is breathing. They say something about the scale and the light and the deepening shadow combines into an experience that is not simply visual, but is felt in the body in a way that is difficult to name. The Hopi have a name for it. The name translates roughly as the canyon speaking or the canyon remembering. It is one of the moments when the membrane between the visible world and the world beneath is at its thinnest. And what moves through the membrane at those moments can be felt by people who have the appropriate relationship with the place. This is not the language of science, but it is the language of people who have spent thousands of years paying close attention to a specific place and who have developed, over that period of attention, a vocabulary for describing what they observe that is precise within its own framework. The grandmother who brought her grandchildren to the rim in the 1950s and told them, in her language, what the canyon's dusk light meant was transmitting more than poetic description. She was transmitting a set of perceptual capacities, a way of attending to a specific environmental phenomenon that had been developed and refined across many generations of the same attention to the same phenomenon. What she was describing was real. The question of whether it is real in the way science can measure or real in the way experience knows is not a question that needs to be answered in order for the description to carry weight. The scientists who have recently begun to take the canyon's traditional knowledge seriously are in many cases not doing so, because they have been persuaded by philosophical arguments about the epistemological validity of indigenous knowledge systems. They are doing so because the knowledge has been right too many times in too many specific ways for them to continue ignoring it. The convergences are too consistent. The specificity of the traditional descriptions in relation to what the instruments find is too striking to be dismissed as coincidence. They are being empirical about the empirical content of the tradition. This is perhaps the most hopeful development in the long story of the relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge. Not the philosophical reconciliation that academics have been advocating for decades, but the pragmatic recognition by working scientists that the tradition tells them where to look, and that when they look where it tells them to look, they find things that would not otherwise have been found. The canyon's archaeology has been shaped by this pragmatic recognition in ways that are small but significant. Survey teams have asked tribal knowledge holders to prioritize sites rather than prioritizing based on accessibility alone. Research designs have been modified to include questions that the traditional knowledge suggests should be asked, and the findings that result from these modifications are consistently more interesting than the findings from conventional survey designs applied to the same terrain. The acoustic survey that found the chamber with cathedral resonance did so, because the tribal consultation pointed toward that area as acoustically significant. The LiDAR survey found the highest concentrations of previously unknown cave entrances in areas flagged by traditional knowledge as warranting attention. The sediment geochemistry study included the 3 Grand Canyon sites specifically because tribal knowledge holders described them as sites of unusual antiquity. None of this is proof. All of it is the kind of convergence that drives science forward. You find something unexpected. You look more carefully. You find more. The model needs revision. You revise the model and look again. The canyon's contribution to this process is the consistent, specific, multigenerational pointing of the traditional knowledge toward things that the instruments, when finally applied, find. What the final picture will look like when all the research is eventually done, when the cave systems are finally mapped, when the deep deposits are finally dated, when the anomalous features are finally analyzed, cannot be predicted from the evidence available now. The surprises, when they come, will be genuine surprises. The canyon has a long history of producing those. What could be said, based on everything we have discussed, is this: the conventional model of Grand Canyon prehistory, in which the canyon's human history begins with the ancestors of current tribal nations somewhere around 12,000 years ago, and consists primarily of increasingly sophisticated agricultural communities culminating in the ancestral puebloans, is almost certainly incomplete in ways that matter. The evidence of earlier human presence, the convergence of traditional knowledge and scientific findings, the pattern of anomalous archaeological features that do not fit existing categories. All of these suggest that the canyon's human story is older, more complex, and more interesting than the conventional model allows. The tribal traditions that describe what is beneath the canyon are not mythology in the sense of being invented accounts designed to explain the unexplainable. They are, at minimum, the accumulated record of generations of careful attention to a specific place, encoding specific observations about specific features in specific locations. They may be considerably more than that. They may be the transmission of knowledge that was acquired through direct encounter with things that are still there, still in those caves, still waiting for the instruments that can finally assess them in full. The warning the elders gave was serious. It has been consistently serious across all the accounts we have reviewed. It should be taken seriously, not with superstitious deference that refuses to look at all, but with the kind of serious attention that recognizes that people who have been warning about something specific for a very long time have usually seen something that justifies the warning. The people who carry that warning now, the Hopi knowledge holders, the Havasupai elders, the Hualapai traditional practitioners, the Navajo ceremony keepers, are not asking for their traditions to be believed without question. They are asking for them to be heard with respect. They are asking for the research to be conducted in relationship rather than in isolation. They are asking, in the language of the 2022 symposium recommendations, for co-management and genuine collaboration and transparent sharing of findings. These are reasonable requests. They are the minimum conditions for doing this work responsibly, and they are slowly, with all the friction that slow institutional processes produce, beginning to be met. Somewhere beneath the canyon, the deep history waits. It has waited through ice ages and warming periods and the rise and fall of the cultures that have lived beside it. It has waited through the colonial period and the establishment of the National Park Service and the passage of NAGPRA and the LiDAR surveys and the sediment geochemistry studies. It has been pointed to consistently and specifically by people who knew it was there for longer than the institutions that now administer the land it lies beneath have existed. The scientists have finally started looking. The instruments are getting better. The collaborative frameworks are being assembled. The convergence of traditional knowledge and scientific investigation is producing findings that neither approach produces alone. The list of priority sites is growing. The research program is slowly taking shape. What will be found eventually will change things. The exact character of the change cannot be predicted. The magnitude of it will depend on what the deep caves actually contain, but that something significant will be found, that the looking that has finally begun will eventually encounter what the warning has always been pointing toward. This much the accumulation of evidence strongly suggests. And when that day comes, when whatever is beneath the canyon is finally brought to light in a form that science can measure and share and argue about, the elders will have been right all along. Not in a simple way, not in a way that vindicates any single tradition's account of exactly what is there and what it means, but in the most fundamental way. In the way that says that people who live beside a place for long enough know things about it that people who arrive with instruments cannot know without their help. The canyon will tell its story when the time is right, in the relationship that makes the telling possible. The elders have always known this. They have maintained the readiness for it across all the generations of the waiting. When the story finally comes, they will be the ones who recognize it as the story they have been keeping, and we will all finally be able to hear it clearly. Go gently, enter with ceremony, bring the relationship with you. And when you find what is there, honor it in the finding. That has always been the instruction. That has always been the warning. And that has always been, in the deepest reading of what the elders were trying to say, the hope. Let us return one more time to the beginning. Not the beginning of this story, though we will pass through it. The beginning before the beginning. The place before the place. The rock at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Vishnu schist, is 1.7 billion years old. To try to hold that number in the mind is an exercise in the limits of human cognition. 1.7 billion years. If you try to count to a billion at one number per second, it would take you about 32 years. 1.7 billion seconds would be more than 50 years. The rock at the bottom of the Grand Canyon has existed for 1.7 billion years. The entire span of complex animal life on Earth is about 600 million years. The Vishnu schist predates that by more than a billion years. It formed before plants existed, before animals existed, before the kind of oxygen-rich atmosphere that makes animal life possible had even been created. The microbes that were creating that atmosphere through photosynthesis were some of the most advanced life forms on Earth when the Vishnu schist formed. Standing at the river level in the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, looking at the dark metamorphic rock on both sides is one of the few places on Earth where you can see this old. Not read about it, not learn about it, actually see it, actually touch it, put your hand on rock that was there before anything you would recognize as an animal had ever existed. The cave systems within that old rock, within and above it, are millions of years old. The passages in the Redwall limestone were formed by water moving through rock that was already hundreds of millions of years old when it was being dissolved. The void spaces, the chambers, the passages, the rooms in the underground architecture of the canyon are the result of processes that operated across millions of years and produced spaces whose full extent is still unmapped. Into this geological deep time, human beings arrived relatively recently. The earliest human presence that the current evidence supports is in the range of 15,000 to 20,000 years before present. Compared to the age of the rock, this is not very long ago. Compared to the conventional timelines of human civilization, it is very long ago indeed. The people who were in this canyon 20,000 years before the present were living in the final stages of the last glacial period. The climate was colder. The vegetation was different. The animals were different. Mammoths and giant ground sloths and horses and camels all lived in the region. The river was different. The hydrology of the Colorado River system during the late Pleistocene was dramatically different from its current configuration, with higher flows, different sediment loads, and different relationships between the river and the cave systems it runs past. People in that world, people adapted to its conditions, would have had a very different relationship with the canyon than the people who came after them. They would have encountered cave entrances that are now either submerged, buried, or high on canyon walls that were then at or near river level. They would have had access to chambers that are now accessible only with specialized equipment. They would have been, in some meaningful sense, the people who discovered the canyon's underground geography, who first learned what it contained and how its passages connected, who developed the first frameworks for understanding what the canyon was. Those frameworks, whatever form they took, were the beginning of what eventually became the traditions the elders carry today. Not in any simple linear sense, not through an unbroken chain of transmission from a specific founding group to the present, but through the accumulated process by which people who live beside a place across enormous spans of time develop knowledge of that place that is, in some portions, genuinely ancient. The Hopi concept of the Sipapu as the place of emergence is not, in this reading, simply a mythological claim about the origin of the world. It is also a historical claim that the people who became the Hopi or their predecessors or the predecessors of their predecessors encountered the canyon at some fundamental moment in their experience as a people, and that encounter was the most formative experience they preserve knowledge of. The emergence was real. Something happened at that place, at that opening in the earth. People came through it, or arrived at it, or found within it something so significant that it became the foundational story of their existence. What that something was is the question that the canyon's deep history addresses. It was not, in the Hopi understanding, simply a cave entrance. It was a place where something was found that could not have been found on the surface, something that made it possible for the people to understand who they were and where they had come from and how they were to live in the world they had entered. The instructions given at the Sipapu are the instructions the Hopi still live by, to maintain the right relationship with the earth, with the Creator, with each other, and with the memory of what came before. Those instructions, in the full depth of their meaning, are not separable from the place where they were given, which is why maintaining the relationship with that place, maintaining the ceremonies that connect the living community to the emergence point, is not merely sentimental tradition. It is the maintenance of the original relationship that makes the instructions legible. Without the relationship to the place, the instructions are words. With the relationship, they are living knowledge. The scientists who have been working in the canyon over the past several decades have, in many cases, been working with an implicit assumption that the canyon's human history can be understood independently of the communities whose ancestors made that history. They have assumed that the material record is separable from the living knowledge, that what is in the caves can be studied without the full participation of the people who have maintained knowledge of those caves across thousands of years. This assumption has produced real scientific knowledge. It does not produce complete scientific knowledge. The incompleteness is not random. It is shaped by what the assumption excludes. The convergences between the traditional knowledge and the scientific findings, documented across the examples we have discussed, are evidence of what is missed when the assumption operates unchallenged. The places where the instruments find things are consistently the places where the traditional knowledge pointed. The things the instruments find are consistently things the traditional knowledge described. The gap is not the gap between the scientific and the traditional. It is the gap between what is found when they work separately and what would be found when they work together. The 2022 symposium was a step toward closing that gap. It was one step. The gap is wide. It has been wide for a long time. Closing it fully will require sustained commitment and institutional investment and genuine good faith from parties whose historical relationship has been, at best, difficult. But the direction is right. The convergence is happening. The looking that has finally begun is looking, for the first time, with eyes that have been prepared by decades of indigenous scientific collaboration, by the passage of NAGPRA, by the LiDAR data and the sediment geochemistry, and the acoustic surveys, by the willingness of a small number of researchers in multiple disciplines to take the traditional knowledge seriously as a source of hypotheses rather than as a collection of stories. The canyon has been holding its deepest secrets for a very long time, not as a withholding, not as a concealment, but as a preservation. The things in the deep caves were preserved by the cave environment, yes, but they were also preserved by the oral traditions that maintained knowledge of them and the protocols that maintained respect for them across all the generations when the institutional machinery of Western science was not interested in them. That preservation has been an act of faithfulness by communities that had every reason to abandon it. The colonial period was devastating to indigenous cultures throughout the Americas. Traditions were actively suppressed. Languages were prohibited. Ceremonies were criminalized. Children were removed from communities to be educated in residential schools where the explicit aim was the elimination of their cultural identities. The maintenance of living oral traditions under those conditions was not easy. The people who maintained the warnings about the canyon's depths through those centuries of systematic assault on their cultures were doing something that deserves to be understood as extraordinary. They maintained the warning not because it was politically convenient or personally advantageous. They maintained it because it was true and because the truth mattered, both for what it said about the past and for what it implied about the present. The warning about what is beneath the canyon was also always a warning about what happens when people forget their relationship to the earth. The thing beneath the canyon, whatever it specifically is evidence of what a previous people built and lost. The warning not to disturb it carelessly is a reminder of how things were lost, not through natural disaster alone, but through the failure of relationship, through forgetting, through building too much and remembering too little. That warning resonates in 2024 in ways that it may not have resonated in 1924 or 1824. The world is not in the same relationship with its own continuation that it was in previous centuries. The evidence of what happens when peoples forget their relationship to the earth is accumulating at a rate that makes the Hopi concept of a third world destroyed by exactly that forgetting feel less like mythology and more like a description. The things beneath the canyon, the evidence of what was there before the current human history of this continent began, are in some sense a mirror. They show us what it looks like when a civilization's traces are preserved beneath the geology of a place where a new civilization is trying to build its understanding of itself. They show us what it looks like from the perspective of the people who have been maintaining knowledge of those traces while the new civilization decided it was not interested. They show us what it will look like, eventually, from the perspective of whatever comes after us, if we are not careful. The warning is also a prediction. Not the specific prediction of a dated event or a named catastrophe, but the structural prediction of a pattern that repeats. When people lose their relationship with the earth, with each other, and with the truth of their own history, what they build eventually goes beneath the earth and is forgotten. The people who come after find traces. They develop traditions about what those traces mean. And if they are wise, those traditions carry forward not just the fact of the traces, but the lesson of what their presence implies. The Hopi have carried that lesson forward. They are carrying it still. The scientists are slowly beginning to hear it in a form that their own epistemological traditions can recognize. The canyon is waiting for that recognition to be complete enough that the looking and the hearing can happen together, in full relationship, producing the understanding that neither can produce alone. That is the story we have been telling. That is the story the canyon has been holding. That is what the warning was always pointing toward. Past the specific facts about specific caves in specific locations. Past the protocols and prohibitions and sacred site designations. All the way to the fundamental question that the deep human history of the Grand Canyon poses to anyone who is paying close enough attention. What do we owe to the knowledge that has been carried for longer than our institutions have existed? What do we owe to the places that hold the evidence of what came before? What do we owe to the people who have maintained a relationship with those places through all the centuries when we were not interested? And what do we owe to the truth itself? The truth of what is in those caves, of who put it there, of when they were here, and what happened to them. The scientists have begun to look. The elders have been pointing the way for a very long time. The canyon holds what it holds in the deep and patient darkness of its unmapped underground passages, waiting for the day when the looking and the pointing and the finding can happen together, in the relationship that makes the finding mean something. That day is closer than it has ever been. The warning finally is being heard. And in the deep places beneath the river and the rock and the 2 billion years of layered earth, something waits. Something old. Something real. Something that the people who have always lived beside this place have always known was there. Rest now, if you are drifting towards sleep. The canyon will hold its secrets a little longer. The warnings will keep. The relationship that makes the finding possible is being built with care, step by careful step, in the spaces between the symposiums and the LiDAR data, and the consultation processes and the old ceremonies that have never stopped. The canyon does not hurry. It has 1.7 billion years of practice at waiting. A few more years of careful, respectful, collaborative looking will not trouble it. But those years matter. The research that happens in them, or does not happen, will shape what we know about the deepest layers of the American story. The choices made in those years about how to look and who to listen to and what to honor in the finding will determine whether what the canyon finally reveals is used in the way the elders' instructions describe, or in the way their warning cautions against. The choices being made now, in the slow work of the collaborative framework, in the relationship between the scientists and the knowledge holders, in the institutional decisions that determine which research gets funded and how it is conducted and who has authority over what it means, these choices matter. The canyon is watching, in the way that 1.7 billion year old rock watches, in the way that places watch when they have been attended to for long enough to have absorbed the attention, in the way that the deep places watch when they have been the subject of ceremony and prayer and careful keeping across more human generations than any living person can count. Go carefully. Go in relationship. Go with the warning in mind and the instruction in hand. The canyon is ready. The elders have been ready for a very long time. And whatever is down there, in the deep places, in the unmapped chambers, in the passages that the instruments are only now beginning to trace, whatever is there has been waiting for the right people to arrive with the right relationship to receive it. May those people be us. May the receiving be worthy of the long keeping. And may the story that comes from it honor all the stories that led here, from the Split-Twig figurine makers and the Sipapu emergence and the Tlish people of the deep earth and the grandmother who told her grandchildren what the canyon's dusk light meant, all the way to the researcher who heard the elders say this is from before and understood, for the first time, that something real was being described. The warning has been given, the looking has begun, and the canyon, patient and old and full of what it holds, is waiting to be understood. Let us spend a moment with something specific, something grounded, something that brings us out of the long arc of geological time and human history and into the texture of particular lives. In 1973, a Hopi man named Thomas Banyasaya was invited to speak to a gathering of United Nations delegates in New York. Banyasaya had been appointed, along with 3 other Hopi men, at a meeting of Hopi elders in 1948 to serve as a messenger to the outside world. His specific mandate was to carry the Hopi message about the condition of the earth to the governments and peoples who were making the decisions that were shaping the planet's future. Banyasaya spent 40 years fulfilling this mandate. He traveled internationally. He spoke at universities and conferences, and to anyone who would listen. His central message, delivered with great patience and great specificity, was the Hopi prophecy that the current world was nearing the end of the cycle that had been described at the time of the emergence, that the signs of this ending were visible in the current state of the earth and of human civilization, and that the choices being made in the present moment by governments and industries and individual human beings would determine whether the ending was catastrophic or transformative. The signs Banyasaya described were drawn from Hopi prophetic tradition and were remarkably specific in some cases. Gourd-shaped weapons that could destroy life across enormous distances, referring to atomic bombs, which had been tested and used before 1948 when the mandate was given. The spinning of a web around the earth, referring to radio and telephone and eventually internet communication. The rivers turning black, referring to oil spills, the seas dying, the air becoming unbreathable, the earth becoming ill from the treatment it was receiving. None of this is mysterious in retrospect. All of it describes conditions that have either occurred or are occurring. The prophecy, in its content if not necessarily in its claimed prophetic origins, is an accurate description of the trajectory the industrial world was on and has continued on. What Banyasaya consistently tied back to the Grand Canyon in his talks and his written communications was the question of what the presence of the Sipapu means for the current moment. The emergence point is not just a historical fact in Hopi understanding. It is a present reality. The relationship between the living community and the emergence point at the canyon is an ongoing relationship, not a commemorated one. The ceremonies that maintain that relationship are maintaining something active, not preserving something past. And that active maintenance is part of what keeps the fourth world stable, keeps the relationship between human beings and the earth in the appropriate configuration that allows the fourth world to continue. This is not a claim that can be verified by instruments. It is a claim about the nature of reality that Western scientific frameworks are not equipped to evaluate. But it is also a claim that has been made consistently by a tradition that has been consistently right about empirical matters that are within the reach of instruments for long enough that the parts that are outside the reach of instruments deserve more than reflexive dismissal. Banyasaya died in 1999, having spent his entire adult life fulfilling the mandate he had been given. He had spoken to the United Nations General Assembly in 1992 after a 20-year effort to gain access to that forum. He described the Hopi message in terms that were, by his own account, the terms he had been prepared to deliver. He was 89 years old. The message he delivered included specific reference to the Grand Canyon and to what it holds, and to why what it holds matters for the future of the world. The delegates listened politely. The General Assembly did not formally take up the Hopi prophecy as a framework for international environmental policy. The world has continued on the trajectory the prophecy described. The canyon is still there, holding what it holds. But the message was delivered. It is in the record. And the people who carried it, Banyasaya and the elders who sent him and the tradition that formed him, were doing something that deserves to be recognized for what it is, a multi-generational effort to communicate across an enormous cultural and epistemological gap. The substance of what native knowledge of the canyon and of the Earth's conditions actually contains is not a mystery. It has been stated repeatedly in various forms across many decades. The warning about what is beneath the canyon is one part of that larger warning. The specific prohibition against disturbing the deep places without appropriate relationship is one expression of the larger truth that the Hopi message carries. That human beings and the earth are in relationship. That the quality of that relationship determines the quality of the world. And that the evidence of what happens when the relationship is broken is preserved in the deep places of the canyon, and is available to those with the appropriate relationship to access it as a lesson that the current world urgently needs. We have been circling this point throughout this entire account. The geological deep time of the canyon, the archaeological evidence of very early human presence, the oral traditions that describe what that presence encountered in the deep places, the convergences between traditional knowledge and scientific findings, the slow institutional work of building collaborative research frameworks. All of it has been circling this point, that the Grand Canyon is not simply a wonder of nature. It is a repository of human history at a depth and a scale that we are only beginning to measure. And the knowledge of what it contains has been maintained across all of that depth and scale by people who have been willing to carry it through everything the colonial period threw at them. The question that every serious engagement with this material eventually arrives at is, what do we do with this? Not what do we do with the canyon, or with the archaeology, or with the traditional knowledge, in some abstract institutional sense. What do we do, right now, as people who have heard this story and who live in the world that the story describes? The Hopi answer to that question is not a complicated one. It is the answer that has always been the answer from the time of the emergence. Maintain the right relationship with the earth and with each other and with the truth of your own history. Do not take more than you give back. Do not forget where you came from. And when you encounter the evidence of what came before you, treat it with the respect that the long keeping of it deserves. These are instructions for a way of living that is not primarily about archaeology. They are instructions about values and relationships and the daily choices that determine what kind of people we are and what kind of world we are building. The canyon's deep history is the context for those instructions, not the content of them. The content is the relationship itself. But the context matters. And knowing that beneath the rock and the river and the cave systems that have never been fully mapped, beneath the 2 billion year geological column and the 20,000 year human history, there is something that the people who have lived beside this place have always known about and have always protected and have always pointed toward. Knowing this is a form of knowledge that changes something in how the world looks. It makes the world look like a place with a history that is much deeper than the written record reaches. It makes the warnings of the elders feel less like relics of a pre-scientific worldview and more like the most informed intelligence available about the specific characteristics of specific places that most people in the world have never had any direct relationship with. It makes the convergence of traditional knowledge and scientific findings feel not like a curiosity, but like an obvious consequence of the fact that careful observation of a place across thousands of years produces knowledge of that place that careful observation across a few decades cannot replicate. And it makes the question of what to do with the canyon and with what it holds feel less like a question about institutional policy, and more like a question about what kind of people we are going to be in relation to the deepest and oldest things we know. The scientists have begun to look. The elders have been pointing the way. The convergence is happening slowly, imperfectly, in the spaces between the symposiums and the fieldwork and the institutional processes and the old ceremonies. The canyon will outlast all of it. The Vishnu schist at its bottom was there before life, as we know it existed. It will be there long after every institution and every tradition and every language in which this story is being told has passed away. The cave systems within it will continue to form and collapse and reform according to the geological processes that have been operating for millions of years. The Colorado River will continue to cut, and the thing beneath the canyon, whatever it specifically is, will continue to wait as it has waited through geological ages and human ages, and the ages of human civilization, and the specific age in which some people have been warning, and some people have been looking. And some people have been slowly, carefully beginning to understand what the warning was pointing toward. The warning has been given. The looking has begun. The finding, when it comes, will change things. And the canyon, which has held this story from the very beginning, will finally be able to let it go. Into the night, into the dark, into whatever wakefulness or dream is waiting on the other side of this long listening. The rock is patient. The cave systems are full. The old knowledge is still being carried by people who know its weight and its worth. And in the deep places beneath the canyon floor, in the unmapped chambers of the Red Wall and the Muav and the ancient Vishnu, the evidence of what was there before us waits quietly for the day when we are ready to receive it as the lesson it was always meant to be. We are getting closer. That is enough for tonight. That is enough. There is one more thing that should be said before we are fully done with this account. One more layer of the story that has not yet been addressed, though it has been present throughout as a kind of undertone. It is about the people who are listening to this. Not in the abstract, but specifically the people who are here right now, at whatever hour this is finding them, in whatever room or bed or dark corner of the world they have settled into for this particular stretch of late night or early morning. The people who came to this story for whatever reason brought them. Curiosity about the Grand Canyon, interest in indigenous traditions, fascination with forbidden history, the simple desire for a voice in the dark that talks about things worth thinking about while the body falls towards sleep. You are, in the most literal possible sense, part of this story. Not because of anything you have done, but because of what you carry. You carry, in your DNA, in the wiring of your nervous system, in the deepest structures of your cognitive architecture, the accumulated product of the same long human history that produced the Hopi emergence tradition and the Havasupai knowledge of the underground water system and the Split-Twig figurine makers who cached their work in the canyon's deep caves 4,000 years ago. You are descended from people who crossed the same kinds of terrain, who lived beside the same kinds of geological wonders, who developed their own traditions for understanding the places they inhabited and the things those places held. Your particular ancestral line may not pass through the Grand Canyon. Your people may never have lived beside it, but the capacity you have for the kind of awareness that the elders describe, the capacity to perceive that a place has depth and history and meaning beyond what the surface presents, the capacity to feel the weight of old knowledge even when you cannot fully articulate what you are feeling. That capacity is not culturally specific. It is human. It is what the Stone Age brain, as the researchers call it, was designed to do with the world it inhabited. To perceive significance, to respond to the presence of the deep and the old with something that is neither purely rational nor purely emotional, but partakes of both. When you stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon and feel small, that feeling is not a mistake. It is an accurate perception. You are small in relation to the canyon, in the same way that the canyon is small in relation to the Earth, and the Earth is small in relation to the solar system, and the solar system is small in relation to the galaxy. The nested scales of existence do not stop being real because the largest of them are too large to hold in mind all at once. And when you hear that beneath the canyon, in the deep places that have never been fully mapped, there is something that people have been maintaining knowledge of for longer than any written history reaches, you feel something in response to that too. That feeling is also not a mistake. It is a recognition. The same recognition the Hopi elder felt when she said, "This is from before," the same recognition that makes the warning feel like wisdom rather than superstition. The same recognition that drives serious researchers to take traditional knowledge seriously in ways their institutional frameworks do not always support. The Grand Canyon is a place that produces recognition, not comfort, necessarily, or consolation, though it can produce those too. Recognition. The sense that something here corresponds to something deep in you, something that was formed over a much longer period than your individual life, that knows this scale and this kind of depth and this relationship to the very old, even if it has not previously encountered this specific version of it. The elders who carry the warning carry it not only because the knowledge they inherited compels them to, but because something in them recognizes what the knowledge describes as real. The scientists who have begun to look do so not only because the data directs them, but because something in them recognizes that the data is pointing towards something that deserves to be understood. And the people who stay up late listening to stories about what the canyon holds are doing so not only out of intellectual curiosity, but because something in them recognizes that these are the kinds of stories that matter. The ones about deep time and old knowledge, and the relationship between human beings and the places they inhabit. All of that recognition is the same thing expressed in different frameworks. The Hopi framework, the scientific framework, the late-night listening framework. It is the human capacity to perceive that something is significant even when the full dimensions of its significance cannot yet be articulated. The canyon is significant. The things it holds are significant. The knowledge that has been maintained about those things across thousands of years is significant. And the moment we are in, the moment when the looking and the pointing are beginning to converge, is significant in ways that are not yet fully visible, but that the weight of accumulated evidence and the pressure of accumulated time make difficult to avoid. Something is happening, slowly, in the way that geological processes are slow and institutional processes are slow, and the turning of large cultural paradigms is slow. But the direction is clear. The convergence is real, and the canyon is holding its breath in the way that 1.7 billion-year-old rock holds its breath, waiting for the moment when the relationship that was described at the emergence point and has been maintained ever since is finally recognized by the institutions and the instruments and the careful interdisciplinary researchers as the most reliable guide to what the canyon contains that has ever existed. The warning was real. The knowledge is real. The things beneath the canyon are real. And we are closer tonight than we have ever been to finding out what they are. Sleep well, if sleep is what you came here for. The canyon will hold its secrets until morning and beyond morning. The elders will continue their ceremonies. The researchers will continue their careful work. The cave systems will continue to hold what they hold in the patient dark. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the river and the rock and the 2 billion years, the old story waits. Not impatiently, not anxiously, but with the patience of something that has been waiting long enough to know that the right time will come. The right people will come. The right relationship will be assembled, piece by careful piece, until it is strong enough to hold the weight of what it needs to hold. That time is coming. We are in it. This is it, or the beginning of it, or the approach to it. The long, slow, collaborative dawn of an understanding that has been a very long time waiting to be understood. Rest now. The canyon will be there when you wake. It has always been there. There is something else worth saying now that the night has grown late, and the story has been told in full. Something about what it means to carry a story like this one. To hold it in your mind and your body and your breath. Stories about deep time do something particular to a human nervous system. They expand it, in a way, not literally but functionally. When you hold in your mind the scale of geological deep time, the 1.7 billion years of the Vishnu schist, the several million years of canyon formation, the 20,000 or more years of human presence, something happens to the scale at which you perceive your own life. The anxieties of the ordinary day, the tasks undone, the emails unanswered, the small frustrations of living in a body in a world that is moving faster than any single body can comfortably track. All of these do not disappear when held against the scale of deep time, but they become smaller in a way that is not diminishing. They become smaller the way a particular stone on a beach becomes smaller when you realize it is part of a cliff face 100 feet high. The stone is still real. It is still itself, but it belongs to something larger, and that belonging gives it a context that changes how it sits in the hand. Knowing this, lying in the dark with the canyon's deep time settling into the body alongside the breath, is itself a kind of homecoming. Not to a specific place, but to a scale. The scale at which the human story actually operates across the full depth of its presence on this earth, in relationship with the specific places that have been inhabited and cared for and warned about and investigated and slowly, carefully, in this long, patient moment, finally beginning to be understood. The canyon will be there in the morning. The elders will be there. The researchers will be there. The canyon endures. It always has. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.